What's up, guys? Welcome to Goofy Harry. We've got something special today. What if Jon Snow found the One Ring beyond the wall and it chose the wrong king? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. What the ice kept the rookery was cold enough to numb Jon's fingers even before he'd finished reading the second letter, and that told him something, because the rookery at Castle Black was always cold, and a man got used to it the way he got used to breathing. This cold was different. It came up through the stone floor like something alive, like the wall itself was leaking winter through its bones. "Bad news travels faster than good," Sam said, watching him from the doorway. "That's what my Septon used to say." "Your Septon never met Alizer Thorn." Jon folded the second letter and set it beside the first. Both were from ranging parties he'd sent west along the wall a fortnight past, 6 men each, ordinary patrols, the kind the watch had run for 1,000 years without incident. Both patrols had found the same thing. Villages of free folk, the ones who hadn't come south with Tormund's people or died fighting Mance's war, simply gone. Not fled. Not raided. Gone, with cook fires still smoking in the hearths and no tracks leading away that any ranger could follow. "That's 4 villages now," Sam said. "I can count, Sam." "I know you can count, Sam adjusted his spectacles, the way he did when he was working up the nerve to say something Jon wouldn't want to hear. "I'm saying it out loud so it's real, because if I don't say it out loud I start telling myself it's wolves or the wildlings moved on without telling anyone, or it's not wolves." Jon stood, and his knees cracked from the cold like old branches. 23 years old, and he already ached like a man twice that. Being murdered by your own brothers did that to you, he supposed. Coming back from it did worse. Get Ed, and find Tormund if he's sober enough to sit a horse. You're going yourself. I'm going myself. Sam didn't argue that a Lord Commander had no business leading rangings beyond the wall. He knew Jon well enough by now to save his breath, but he did give Jon a look, the particular look of a friend who has decided not to fight a battle he knows he'll lose, and went to find Ed. Alizer Thorn found Jon first, in the armory, buckling on the black leather that had replaced the mail he'd worn as a boy in the Night's Watch training yard. Thorn stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it always did around Jon now. Not quite a sneer, not quite respect, something curdled in between. 4 villages of savages go missing beyond the wall, Thorn said, and the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch decides the proper response is to go look at the empty huts himself. That's the plan. You have officers for this. You have rangers whose whole purpose in life is to go get killed beyond the wall so lords in castles don't have to. I was a ranger, Sir Alizer. Before I was anything else I was that. Jon pulled the buckle tight and reached for his sword belt. "I'm not asking your leave." "No," Thorn agreed, "you're not. You never do." He didn't move from the doorway for a moment, and something passed behind his eyes that Jon couldn't read. Not quite anger. Something closer to a man watching weather roll in that he can't do anything about. "You know what they'll say if you die out there. Bastard boy plays Lord Commander for half a year, then wanders off into the haunted forest and gets himself eaten by something with too many teeth. It won't matter that you beat Mance Raider's army. It won't matter that you're the reason half this castle is still breathing. It'll just be one more story about how a Snow was never fit to wear the cloak in the first place." "Then I suppose I'd best not die," Jon said, and buckled Longclaw at his hip, and left Thorn standing in the doorway with the rest of whatever he'd meant to say still unsaid. They rode out through the gate an hour past dawn, Jon, Ed, Tormund Giantsbane looking like a bear that had been poured into a horse saddle, Gren, Satin, and a wildling scout named Leathers who knew the ground north of Storrold's point better than any man living, because he'd buried 3 wives out there and never forgotten a foot of it. Ghost went ahead of them, a white shape sliding between black trees, and came back twice in the first hour to press against Jon's leg and whine low in his throat before running off again. Wolf doesn't like something, Tormund observed. Wolf never likes anything past the wall, said Gren. That's why he's smart and we're not. They'd gone 3 days north and west, following the line of dead villages, when Leathers found the tracks that weren't tracks, long smooth grooves in the frost-crusted earth like something heavy had been dragged, except the grooves ran uphill in places where nothing could be dragged, and they ended all of them at the same low ridge of black stone jutting from the snow like a rotten tooth. That's Storrold's point, Leathers said. He didn't dismount. Old ruin. Older than old. My gran used to say the first men built it before they built anything else. Before the wall, before the night fort, before any of it. Said a king lived there once who tried to be a god and the ice ate him for his trouble. Charming, said Ed. Can we not go there? We have to go there, Jon said, and swung down off his horse. The ridge wasn't stone at all. Once they got close, it was a wall or the top 3 feet of one. Everything below it swallowed by 8,000 years of snowfall packed down into ice as hard as iron. There was a doorway, half collapsed, choked with rubble that Tormund and Gren spent the better part of an hour clearing while Ghost paced the tree line and refused to come any closer. Something's got him spooked good, Tormund said, tossing aside a block of stone the size of a barrel. Something's got me spooked good, Ed muttered, and I'm not even a wolf. Inside, the cold changed character entirely. Beyond the wall, the cold was a living thing, biting and restless, wind-driven, full of intention. Inside the buried keep of Storrold's Point, the cold was still, a held breath, a held silence, the particular quiet of a room that has not had anyone breathe in it for longer than any man's grandfather's grandfather could remember. Their torches threw long shivering light across walls carved with runes none of them could read. First men's script gone strange and angular with age. Spirals and jagged lines that might have been a language or might have been a warning. This is a bad idea, Satin said quietly, close at Jon's shoulder. I want it noted for whoever writes the history that I said this was a bad idea. Noted, said Jon. They went deeper. The passage sloped down, ice thickening on the walls until it wasn't stone they were walking past anymore, but ice with stone somewhere inside it, ancient masonry drowned and preserved. Twice they passed doorways choked entirely with ice, blue-white and impenetrable, and once Gren swore he saw a shape frozen inside one of those walls, man-sized, arms raised. But when they brought the torch closer, it was only a trick of the light on broken stone, or so they told each other, because none of them wanted it to be anything else. The passage ended in a hall. It had been a great hall once, a throne room by the size and shape of it, though the roof had come down at some point in the ancient past, and then the ice had come after and sealed the wreckage into something between a tomb and a monument. Their torchlight didn't reach the far walls. It reached instead the throne, a heavy seat of black stone at the top of a short dais, half buried in ice that had crept up its legs like slow water, and the thing that sat on it. That'll be the king, then, Tormund said, very quietly for a man his size. He'd been a big man once, whoever he was. Even shriveled and frozen and mummified by 8 millennia of cold, the bones under the rotted furs on that throne spoke of a big man, broad through the shoulder, and there was a crown on his skull that wasn't gold or silver but something darker, iron gone black with age, set with a single dead stone that might once have been a garnet. His jaw hung open, his hands rested on the arms of the throne, and one of them, the left, was closed into a fist, ice grown up around the knuckles like frost on a window, and something inside that fist caught the torchlight and threw it back gold. Nobody touch anything, Jon said. Naturally, someone touched something. It was one of Leathers's people, a wildling named Orn who joined them at the last village they'd passed, hungry and hollow-eyed, and looking for something to loot from a place that clearly hadn't been looted in longer than history remembered. He drifted to the base of the dais while the others were still staring up at the dead king's crown, and by the time Jon turned, Orn had already worked 2 fingers into that frozen fist, trying to pry it open. "Orn," Jon said, "leave it." Orn didn't leave it. His fingers closed around whatever gold thing was inside that dead grip, and he pulled, and the fist came apart at the wrist with a sound like a dry branch snapping, and Orn screamed. Not from the gold, from the cold. His whole hand went white in an instant, then blue, frost crawling up his wrist and forearm faster than any cold Jon had ever seen, faster than anything natural. And Orn was on his knees screaming, and trying to shake something off his hand that wasn't there anymore, because the object had already fallen from his frozen fingers and rolled away across the ice with a small, bright, absurdly ordinary sound, like a coin dropped on a table. Gren had his knife out and cut Orn's furs open at the shoulder, and between them he and Tormund got the man's cloak wrapped tight around the ruined arm. But it didn't matter. By the time they'd carried him back up the passage into what passed for daylight, the arm from the elbow down was dead, black-fingered, frostbitten through in a way that should have taken hours in that cold, not seconds. "It ain't right," Tormund said, staring back down the passage into the dark. "Cold that fast. That ain't right, Snow." "No," Jon agreed, "it isn't." He went back for the ring alone. He told himself it was because he was Lord Commander, and it was his responsibility to see what had cost a man his arm. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that something in him wanted to see it, wanted to know what a dead First Men king would keep clenched in his fist for 8,000 years. What could be worth guarding through the fall of an entire keep and the burial of an entire kingdom under ice? It was lying where it had rolled, a few feet from the base of the throne, and by torchlight it looked like nothing at all. A plain gold band. No stone, no engraving that he could see, no ornament of any kind, the kind of ring a poor man might buy his bride, not the kind a king would guard with his dying hand. Jon crouched beside it and did not touch it for a long moment, just looked, the way you'd look at a snake you weren't certain was dead. It wasn't cold. That was the first thing. Everything in that hall was cold enough to kill, cold enough that his own breath was freezing on his beard, but the ring lay on the ice radiating a faint, impossible warmth, like a coal banked under ash. "You going to pick that up or court it first?" Tormund's voice from the passage entrance, not quite steady despite the joke. Jon picked it up. Nothing happened. No frost, no scream, no black rot creeping up his arm. It sat in his palm warm as a held stone from a hearth fire, and up close he could see there was writing on the inside of the band after all, so fine it might have been scratched with a needle, not First Men runes, not any script he recognized, flowing and strange, the letters seeming almost to shift when he wasn't looking at them directly. He should have left it. He knew that, even then. Some old animal part of him recognizing a thing too large for the hand holding it. But he was Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and the Night's Watch existed to know what walked and crept and hid in the haunted forest, and a thing that could take a man's arm in seconds, and yet lay warm as summer in a tomb of ice, was exactly the sort of thing the watch was meant to understand. He put it in the small leather pouch at his belt, the one he kept dragonglass in, and did not put it on. Above the throne, carved into the black stone in letters worn nearly smooth, was a single line of script that Leathers, who'd spent more winters beyond the wall than any man there, and had picked up more of the old tongues than he let on, squinted at for a long time before he spoke. "Says a name," Leathers said finally. Roderick Snow." He glanced at Jon, and something uncomfortable passed over his weathered face. "Says he was king here once. Says he wore something that made him strong enough to break the long night's grip on these lands, strong enough his own lords feared him more than they feared the dark. Says..." Leathers stopped. "Says what?" Says his own men killed him for it. Says the thing he wore was the reason the ice came back and buried this whole hold, because it burned so bright it drew every eye in the dark toward it, and the dark does not forgive men who shine too fierce. Nobody said anything for a moment. Tormund, of all people, was the one who broke the silence, though there was none of his usual bluster in it. "Snow," he said. "Same name as you, boy." "Common enough name for a bastard," Jon said, though something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature had settled behind his ribs. They carried Orn out. He lived long enough to see the sky again before the fever from the frostbite took him in the night, delirious, muttering about cold hands closing around his throat that none of the others could see. They buried him in a cairn of stones because the ground was too hard to dig, and Jon said what words a man says over another man's grave beyond the wall, and none of it felt like enough, and they started south before midday because Ghost would not stop pacing the tree line, hackles up, growling at something none of the rest of them could see either. They made it 4 miles before the dead came for them. It was Ghost who gave the first warning, a single sound, not quite a howl, more a scream torn out of an animal that didn't want to make it, and then he was gone into the trees like a white arrow. Jon had his sword out and was already turning his horse when the first of them stepped out of the tree line, and his mind, in the half-second before everything went to blood and noise, did the thing minds do in moments like that. It tried to make sense of what it was seeing and failed. It had been a wildling once. A woman, by the remains of the dress, though there was no telling her age or her face because both had been half torn away by something, exposed bone gleaming blue-white in the fading light. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky just before the stars come out, and they fixed on Jon's horse with an intelligence that had no business existing in a face that dead. "Wights," Tormund bellowed, and then there were more of them coming out of the trees on every side, a dozen at least, moving with that horrible loping unhuman grace, and the horses screamed and reared, and one of them, Satin's, went down thrashing as 3 of the things swarmed it, and Satin went down with it. Jon's sword was dragonglass-edged where it mattered, Longclaw's Valyrian steel humming through the cold air as he cut the first wight from its horse legs, and it kept crawling anyway, fingers clawing at the frozen ground, until Gren put a torch to it, and it went up in flame with a shriek that had no breath behind it, just wind pushed through a dead throat. "To me," Jon shouted, "form up, backs together, don't let them get behind." One of them got behind Ed. He turned in time to take its head half off with his axe, but 2 more were already on him, and Jon put his horse between them and cut down through a Wight's shoulder and out its ribs, and it kept coming, hands still reaching, until he took its head clean and the light in those blue eyes finally went out. There were too many. That was the plain fact of it, cutting through the panic and the noise. There were too many of them and not enough of the living. And Leathers went down screaming with 3 of them on top of him and did not get back up. And Tormund was roaring and swinging his axe two-handed and taking heads with every blow. But there was always another one behind the one he just felled. Always another. An endless dark tide flowing out of the trees. Jon's horse went down under him. A wight had gotten its dead teeth into the animal's leg, and it screamed and buckled, and Jon went sprawling into the snow, and Longclaw skidded away from his hand into the dark. And above him the sky was full of wheeling black shapes because the crows had come too, drawn by death the way crows always were, and 3 wights were closing on him where he lay, and his sword was 6 feet away, and his legs weren't answering fast enough in this. He thought with a strange, distant clarity. This is how it happens. This is how I die the second time, and there won't be a Melisandre or a Thoros or anyone at all to bring me back from it out here. His hand, scrabbling for anything, closed on the leather pouch at his belt instead of the ground, and the pouch had come open in the fall, and his fingers found the ring. He did not decide to put it on. There was no moment of choice in it that he could ever afterward describe honestly, no weighing of costs, no temptation offered and considered. His body simply did it, the way a drowning man's hand closes on driftwood, and the band slid onto the third finger of his right hand, and the world went very quiet and very slow and very, very clear. The Wights were still coming. He could see each of them now with a strange, perfect precision. See the exact angle of the nearest one's dead-reaching hand. See the ice crystals in its ruined eye sockets. See, with a clarity that had nothing to do with his eyes at all, the thin cold thread of something that ran back from each of these creatures into the north, into the dark. A leash he had no name for but understood instantly and completely as a will that was not their own. And that will, whatever it was, wherever it lived, felt him. It was like a hand closing on his shoulder from 100 miles away, a vast, ancient, patient attention swinging toward him the way a man's head turns at an unexpected sound in a quiet room. For one heartbeat, Jon Snow felt himself seen by something that had been old when the first men were young, something cold and endless and utterly without pity, and it did not know him, could not place him, and that not knowing struck through that ancient will like a splinter of ice through a wound. Then the moment passed, and Jon was on his feet. He didn't remember standing, and Longclaw was in his hand again, though he hadn't consciously reached for it. And the nearest Wight came at him with its dead teeth bared, and he took it apart. Not killed, took apart, the way a man might take apart something he'd built himself and understood down to the joinery, his blade finding the exact places where the cold magic knitting those dead bones together was thinnest, weakest, most easily unraveled. The Wight came apart in a spray of shattering ice, and it never even completed its lunge. He moved through the rest of them like water moves through fingers. He was aware, distantly, of Tormund shouting something, of Gren staring at him with his mouth open, but mostly he was aware of the Wights themselves, and of how wrong it felt to them suddenly to be near him. 3 of them actually recoiled, actually flinched back from him the way a man flinches from an open flame, their dead eyes flaring wide with something that might in a living thing have been called fear. He did not feel stronger exactly. He felt correct. He felt like a key that had finally found the lock it was cut for, and the lock was this cold, this dark, this dead army of a will that hated the world and everything living in it. The last Wight went down burning, though he'd lit no torch to it. It simply caught fire where he struck it, blue flame racing up dead flesh far too fast to be natural, and then it was over. 6 of them lay in pieces or ash across the trampled snow, and Jon stood in the middle of it breathing hard, Longclaw dripping black ichor, and looked down at his own right hand as if it belonged to a stranger. The ring was still there, warm, utterly unremarkable to look at, sitting on his finger as though it had always been there. "Jon," Tormund's voice, careful in a way Tormund's voice never was. "Jon, lad, what in 7 bloody hells was that?" Gren hadn't found words yet at all. Ed, blood running from a shallow cut above his eye, looked at Jon the way a man looks at a fire that's just leapt higher than it should have any right to. "I don't know," Jon said honestly. His heart was hammering, but not from fear, from something closer to vertigo, the feeling of having stepped off a height and discovered midair that he could fly and not knowing why or for how long or what would happen when he came down. "I don't know what that was." Satin was dead. So was Leathers. They found what was left of them in the trampled dark and could not do much for either but close their eyes and say the words, quicker this time, because none of them wanted to stay in those woods a moment longer than they had to. And because, though nobody said it aloud, all of them, even Tormund, kept glancing sideways at Jon Snow as if he'd become, in the space of one desperate minute, a different sort of man than the one who'd ridden out with them 3 days before. They rode south hard and did not stop again until they saw the wall rising pale and vast against the stars. And even then Jon slept badly, Ghost pressed hard against his side the whole night, as if standing guard against something none of the rest of them could see. He took the ring off before they reached Castle Black. He told himself it was prudence. A Lord Commander wearing an unexplained magic ring found on a dead First Men King's hand was not a story that would help him with Alizar Thorn, or with the brothers who already whispered about wildling blood magic and things a man shouldn't meddle with. But that wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that taking it off felt, for one disorienting moment, like losing a limb, and that frightened him more than the Wights had. Alone in his chambers that night, with Ghost asleep across the doorway and the castle quiet around him, Jon sat by the low fire and turned the ring over in his fingers, watching the strange script along the inside of the band catch the firelight and seem, for just a moment, to almost resolve into words he could nearly read. He did not put it on. He told himself that was strength, that was discipline, a lesson learned from a dead king named Roderick Snow, who'd worn a thing like this and burned too bright and been murdered for it by men who feared what he'd become. He told himself he would learn what it was before he ever wore it again, would ask Sam to search every book in the library for some mention of a ring the first men feared enough to bury a king and a keep, and 8,000 years of silence over. He did not know, sitting there with the fire dying low and the wind picking up outside, that far to the north, on a ridge of black rock above a frozen lake, something that had not needed to feel surprise in 10,000 years stood utterly still in the dark, its pale ancient face turned south, its cold eyes fixed on nothing a living man could have seen, listening, the way a spider listens for a fly's wing against its web, for the small, wrong, impossible warmth that had briefly touched the edge of its dominion and refused, against every law that will had ever known, to be claimed. It had built its army out of despair and death, and the certainty that nothing living could resist the cold forever. It had watched kings rise and burn bright and be extinguished by their own fear-maddened subjects for 8,000 years, patient as ice, patient as the turning of ages, because fire always burned itself out in the end, and the dark always won by simply outlasting it. It had never, in all that patient watching, felt something reach toward its power and refuse to be dominated by it, nor felt its own power reach toward something and be, however briefly, refused in turn. The wind rose. Snow began to fall, fine and hard as ash, sweeping down off the ridge and out across the haunted forest, south, toward the wall, toward the fires of men, toward a bastard boy asleep with a direwolf at his door and a stranger's ring cooling slowly in his open hand. Something old and patient had just learned, for the first time in longer than memory, that the world still held a surprise for it. It did not sleep. It had never slept. But that night, for the first time in 10,000 years, it thought. And what it thought about, turning the problem over with the terrible slow patience of something that had all the time in the world and had just discovered it might not, after all, have quite enough, was Jon Snow. Chapter 2. The weight of it. The morning after they came back through the gate, Sam found Jon on top of the wall, standing at the edge of the lift cage platform with his cloak snapping in the wind, looking north the way he'd been looking north every morning since he was old enough to climb the stairs. "You didn't sleep," Sam said. It wasn't a question. Sam had gotten good this past year at reading Jon's face the way other men read weather. "I slept some." "You look like you didn't sleep at all. You look like—" Sam stopped himself, glanced around at the two men working the winch 30 feet off, lowered his voice anyway. "Ed told me about the ranging, about leathers and satin and that poor wildling who touched the thing in the tomb. He told me some other things too, said you fought like you'd been possessed." "Ed exaggerates." "Ed doesn't exaggerate, Jon. Ed's the least exaggerating person I've ever met. He thinks a bad day is when the porridge is cold." Sam pulled his gloves tighter, breath fogging white. He said you took 6 wights apart in under a minute. Said you moved faster than he's ever seen a man move. Said 2 of them ran from you. Wights don't run, Jon. Wights don't feel anything to run from. Jon didn't answer right away. Below them the courtyard was waking up, brothers moving between the buildings with buckets and firewood, and the particular hunched shuffle of men who hated the cold and had made peace with hating it forever. Somewhere a dog was barking. It was, in every visible way, an ordinary morning at the end of the world. I found something in the tomb, Jon said finally. A ring. I don't know what it is, Sam. I put it on when I fell and lost my sword because I didn't have anything else, and then I could see things, feel things. The wights, what was moving them, where the weakness was in whatever magic holds them together. I took it off before we reached the gate. Sam went very still, the way he did when his mind had latched onto a problem and started chewing at it whether he wanted it to or not. Where is it now? In my chambers, locked in the chest. Can I see it? Jon said it faster than he meant to, and something in his own voice surprised him, a flicker of possessiveness he hadn't chosen and didn't like finding in himself. He softened it. Not yet. I want to know what it is before anyone else touches it. I already lost a man to it who didn't even put it on, just tried to pull it out of a dead man's hand. I'm not risking you next. That's Jon. That's very touching, truly, but I'm the one with the books. I'm the one who reads Valyrian and High Bravosi and half the runic scripts in that library that nobody's opened since before the conquest. If you want to know what it is, I'm the tool for the job, not the danger to protect from the job. Jon looked at him for a long moment, and something in his chest, tight since the tomb, tight since the wights, tight since the moment he'd felt something ancient and vast turn its attention toward him from 100 miles away, eased just slightly at the sight of Sam Tarly standing there red-faced and stubborn and entirely unafraid. All right, Jon said. You can look, you don't touch it. I don't touch it, Sam agreed. I'm not an idiot, whatever Gren says. The library at Castle Black was a cramped, cold, badly lit room 3 stories up in the King's Tower, its shelves sagging under the weight of records nobody read, and a scattering of older, stranger volumes that predated even the Watch's own founding. Books the Meisters of the Citadel had never catalogued, because half of them weren't written in any tongue the Citadel recognized. Sam had spent the better part of a year in that room since Eamon died, cataloging what he could, and he brought that same dogged patience to the ring the moment Jon said it, wrapped in a strip of black wool on the table between them. He didn't touch it. He circled it the way a man circles a snake he's decided to study rather than kill, bending close, squinting at the faint inscription along the inner band that Jon had described. Though from the outside it looked like nothing, a plain gold circle, warm to the eye somehow even by cold morning light, as if it remembered heat from somewhere it hadn't been in a very long time. Roderick Snow, Sam murmured, more to himself than to Jon. That name's not in any record I've found. Not in the Watch's rolls, not in the old First Men King lists the Meisters compiled after the Andals came. And believe me, I've read every version of those lists we have. There are 4 different ones and they disagree about nearly everything, but none of them mention a King Roderick north of the Wall. Which either means he's so old the lists don't reach back that far, or he was erased, Jon said. Sam looked up. Erased? Leathers said his own men killed him. Said the thing he wore burned too bright and drew the dark's eye, and his lords feared him more than they feared the ice, so they murdered him for it. Jon turned the ring slowly with one gloved finger, careful not to let his bare skin touch it. A man like that, killed by his own people, they wouldn't want to remember him afterward. Wouldn't want their children asking why they killed their own king. Easier to bury the whole story with the body. Sam swallowed. That's a genuinely unsettling theory, and I hate that it's the one that makes the most sense. He straightened up, rubbed his eyes behind his spectacles, and looked at Jon with a particular seriousness he reserved for moments when he'd stopped being excited about a puzzle and started being afraid of the answer. Jon, I want you to actually hear what I'm about to say, and not just nod at me the way you do when you've already decided something and you're being polite about listening to the rest of the conversation. I don't do that. You absolutely do that. You've done it to me at least 40 times this year. Listen. Sam took a breath. Whatever this is, it's not sorcery the way we understand sorcery here. It's not like the Red Woman's fire magic, or whatever the wildling skinchangers do, or even whatever's animating the Wights, which at least has some logic to it, some pattern, cold calling to cold. This thing feels older than that. Older than the wall. Older, maybe, than anything in this library, and I want to say that carefully because it sounds mad even saying it out loud. But I don't think this ring came from anywhere in this world at all. Jon didn't laugh. He'd expected to laugh, if anyone ever said something like that to him, but sitting in that cold room with the ring lying warm and quiet on the table, and the memory of that vast cold attention turning toward him still fresh enough to make his skin crawl, he found he had no laughter in him for it. Where would it come from then, he said, if not from here? I don't know, Sam said. I genuinely don't know, and that terrifies me more than any answer I could imagine, because I've spent my whole life believing that if I read enough, I could know anything. I don't think that's true of this. I think this is a mystery that predates the books. All I can tell you is what I felt when I got close to it just now, standing here, not even touching it. I felt like it was listening, like it knew I was talking about it. He looked down at the plain gold band, and for once in his life, Samwell Tarly looked like a man who very much wished he did not know what he just said out loud was probably true. Put it away, Jon. Please, lock it up. Don't wear it again unless you truly have no other choice. I already promised myself that. Good, Sam said, because I don't think you're the kind of man it wants to make into what it's clearly made other men into before you, but I also don't think, not the kind of man it wants, means safe. I think it means something worse. I think it means it's still trying to figure out what you are. Alizer Thorne heard about the tomb from Gren, who told it to Pip over supper without meaning it to travel any further. And Pip told it to 2 other brothers, because Pip had never in his life managed to keep his mouth shut about anything interesting. And by the 3rd day after the Ranging's return, half of Castle Black had some garbled version of the story. A bastard Lord Commander finds a magic ring in a haunted tomb beyond the wall, kills 6 Wights barehanded, brings the cursed thing back through the gate, and won't say what it is. Thorne came to Jon's chambers that evening with Bowen Marsh trailing a half-step behind him, the Lord Steward's round, worried face doing what it always did when he sensed trouble brewing that his ledgers had no line for. You'll want to sit down for this, Jon said dryly, before either of them had said a word, seeing as you've both walked all the way up here with faces like you're delivering bad news to a widow. We've come about the ring, Thorne said without preamble. He never did preambles. The men are talking. Men talk. It's mostly what men do when there's no fighting to be had. They're talking about sorcery, Lord Snow. Wildling sorcery, or worse. First men magic older than any of it, pulled up out of a grave beyond the wall and carried through our gate without so much as a word to the watch's officers about what it might do, or bring. Thorne's dark eyes didn't blink much. Jon had noticed that about him years ago, back when he'd been a green boy training under the man's contempt in the yard. I've spent 30 years on this wall watching lords and kings treat magic like a tool they can pick up and set down as they please. It's never once gone the way they thought it would. I haven't touched it since the Ranging. That's not what I asked. You didn't ask anything, Sir Alizer, you made a speech. Jon kept his voice level, though something in him, something he was starting to recognize as new, or at least newly close to the surface, wanted to push back harder than that, wanted to remind Thorne exactly whose cloak he was wearing and exactly who had died to earn the right to wear it. He didn't let it out. That, he thought, mattered. That restraint was the whole difference between himself and whoever Roderick Snow had been. I have it locked away. Sam's studying what he can of it. When I know something worth telling the watch, I'll tell the watch. Until then, it's mine to hold, and I'll hold it responsibly, which is more than I can say for how you've held your tongue about my parentage the last 7 years, so forgive me if I don't leap to explain myself to you on this. Bowen Marsh made a small unhappy noise, the sound of a peacemaker realizing the peace had already failed. Thorne's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to it. He'd learned this past year that rising to Jon Snow rarely got him anywhere he wanted to go. A commander who keeps secrets from his own officers, Thorne said instead, quiet and precise, is a commander his officers will stop trusting. That's not a threat, Lord Snow. It's an observation from a man who's watched the watch fracture before over less. Noted, Jon said, echoing without quite meaning to the word Satin had used before he died. Anything else? A raven came in from Eastwatch this morning, Marsh said, glad of the change of subject. Cotter Pike reports ships. A great many ships flying Baratheon colors put in at the harbor 3 days past. He says it's Stannis. Stannis Baratheon himself, come ashore with an army at his back and some red priestess of his at his side, and he's asking after the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch by name. That, at least, drove the ring briefly out of the conversation entirely. He's coming here, Jon asked. He's already on the King's Road by Pike's account, should reach Castle Black within the fortnight. Marsh hesitated. A king with an army and a red witch, Lord Snow, wanting words with you specifically, on the heels of everything else that's happened. I don't like the timing of it any more than Sir Alizer likes the ring. Thorne, for once, didn't look smug about being agreed with. He looked, if anything, more troubled than before. A man who'd spent his whole life certain the Watch's greatest danger came from wildlings and bastards and the soft-hearted fools who trusted them. Now watching 2 separate storms roll in from 2 separate directions at once, and no longer sure which one to brace against first. Send word when he's a day out, Jon said. I want the gate manned properly, not left to whoever's on duty. And the ring, Thorne pressed, on his way out the door. Stays locked away, Jon said, until I say otherwise. He kept that promise for 6 days. It was the 7th night when the horn sounded. Not the 2 blasts that meant rangers returning, but the single long note, over and over, that every man on the wall had drilled into his bones meant wildlings. And under that particular horn call, in the specific dread language, the watch had built for itself over centuries. One long note repeated without pause meant something worse than wildlings. It meant the dead were coming, and they were coming at the wall itself. Jon was already moving before the 3rd blast finished, boots half-laced, longclaw in hand, taking the stairs to the top 3 at a time with his heart hammering not from fear exactly but from the cold clarity of a man whose body had done this before, drilled this before, believed this might happen someday and trained for it anyway. The scene atop the wall was chaos edging toward panic. Torches everywhere, men shouting, and below on the ice, not far below, close enough that arrows could reach them and did, uselessly, a mass of dark shapes moving against the snow. Not a dozen this time, not even 100. Jon reached the parapet and looked down and felt something in his chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, because there had to be 300 of them at least. Wights shambling out of the tree line in a solid black tide, and at the edge of the torchlight, standing motionless among the trees where the light didn't quite reach, pale shapes that moved with none of the Wights' clumsy hunger, the others themselves, come to test the wall for the first time in 8,000 years. They're trying to climb, Ed said, arriving at his shoulder breathless. Gren says there's ropes, no, not ropes, ice, they're growing ice up the face of it, look. He was right. Along one stretch of the wall, perhaps 200 yards east of the gate, a pale blue-white ridge was creeping up the ancient ice, unnaturally smooth and unnaturally fast, a ladder built by will alone, and the first Wights were already climbing it, clawing their way up hand over hand with a speed no living climber could have matched. "Oil," Jon snapped. "Get the oil pots up here, all of them, and every man who can throw a torch straight." They fought. Men died. A brother named Cugin went off the parapet with a Wight's dead hands locked around his ankle, and both of them fell together into the dark, and neither of them made a sound worth remembering afterward. And that was how it went for the better part of an hour, oil poured, fire thrown. Wights burning and shrieking their windless shrieks and falling in flaming arcs back down onto the ones still climbing beneath them. And still more came, and still the ice ladder grew, thickening, spreading, reaching for new stretches of the wall like a disease. Jon fought along the parapet with the others, cutting down every Wight that made the top, and he was good. He'd always been good, trained hard and fought harder, and Longclaw's Valyrian steel, and the dragonglass edge he'd had fitted into the crossguard made him more dangerous still. But he could feel, with every passing minute, that this was a fight the Watch could not simply outfight. There were too many climbers and not enough oil, and somewhere below in the dark, patient among the trees, the others were watching to see exactly how thin the Watch's defense would stretch before it tore. He made the decision in the space of a single indrawn breath. "Ed, hold this section. I need 5 minutes. Jon, where in the 7 hells do you think you're?" He was already gone, taking the stairs down 2 at a time, sprinting across the courtyard past brothers running the other way with buckets and spears, into the king's tower, up to his chambers, to the locked chest at the foot of his bed. His hands weren't quite steady as he found the key, and some distant, sane part of him noted that and filed it away for later examination, because a man's hands shaking before a fight and a man's hands shaking before this were not, he suspected, the same thing at all. The ring lay in its wool wrapping exactly where he'd left it, warm as a coal. "I don't think it's safe. I think it means it's still trying to figure out what you are." Sam's voice, unbidden in his head. Above him, through the tower window, he could hear the horn still blowing, and beneath it, new and worse, the sound of men screaming. He put the ring on. The world went sharp again, the way it had beyond the wall, that terrible clarifying quiet dropping over everything like a held breath. He was aware of the ring's warmth spreading up through his hand, his wrist, his whole arm, and aware too, distantly, hugely, of that same vast cold attention he'd felt in the forest, turned now not toward some far horizon but toward the wall itself, toward this exact spot, focused and immediate in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his sleeves. Whatever was out there in the dark leading this attack, it knew now precisely where he was. Good, something in him thought, with a coldness that startled him even as he thought it. Let it come and see. He was back up the stairs and onto the parapet in under 2 minutes, and the fight had gotten worse in his absence. A whole section of the eastern stretch had gone red-orange with burning Wights and screaming men, and 3 brothers lay dead or dying near the winch housing where a knot of Wights had broken through, and Alizer Thorne himself was there among them, sword in hand, blood on his face, fighting like the hardened old soldier he'd always been beneath the sneering. Jon didn't shout a warning. There wasn't time. He simply moved. And for the second time in his life, he felt his body do things his mind had never trained it to do, not because some outside force was puppeting him, but because the ring seemed to sharpen everything that was already in him, his instincts, his reflexes, his understanding of exactly where a blade needed to go, and exactly how much force a joint could take before it gave, until the space between deciding and doing collapsed to almost nothing at all. He crossed 40 feet of parapet faster than any man should have been able to run on ice, and put himself between Thorne and the 3 Wights closing on his flank, and took all 3 apart in 4 strokes, Longclaw moving in patterns that had no wasted motion in them anywhere, cold sparks flying where dragonglass met whatever unnatural cold held those dead things together. One of the Wights, for the second time in his life, actually recoiled from him before he struck it, actually flinched, dead eyes flaring wide with something that in a living face would have been called dread. And Jon killed it anyway, and felt no pity in doing it, only a clean, correct satisfaction that frightened him slightly even as he felt it. "Get the men off this section," he called to Thorn, not even breathing hard. "Fall back 30 yards, regroup at the winch." Thorn stared at him. There was blood on the old knight's face and exhaustion in every line of him, but the look he gave Jon in that moment had nothing to do with either. It was the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the person standing in front of him, and not liking any of the new sums he was arriving at. "What in the 7 bloody hells are you?" Thorn said, low, almost lost under the noise of the fight around them. "The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch," Jon said, "doing his job." "Fall back and regroup, Sir Alizer, that's an order." Thorn fell back. He gave the order to the others, and they did too. And Jon turned to the ice ladder still climbing the wall face, and did something he would spend a long time afterward trying to understand himself. He reached out, not with his sword, not with his hands at all, but with something else entirely, some new sense the ring had opened in him like a shutter thrown back from a window, and pulled at the cold magic holding that ladder together the way he'd learned, beyond the wall. To find the weak seams in a Wight's animation, the ladder shattered, all 200 yards of it, cracking and crumbling and sloughing away from the wall's face in an avalanche of blue-white ice, taking a dozen climbing Wights down with it into the dark. And for one moment the entire eastern stretch of the wall fell silent except for the roar of falling ice and the distant, furious shriek of something in the tree line below that was not a Wight's voice at all. Something older, colder, and for the first time in 10,000 years, unmistakably, humanly angry. Jon stood at the parapet's edge, breathing hard now, the ring's warmth pulsing faintly against his skin like a second heartbeat, and looked down into the dark where the others waited among the trees, and felt that vast cold attention bear down on him again, harder this time, testing, pressing, and felt himself, without quite understanding how, press back. The attack broke within the hour. Whatever will drove the Wights forward seemed to falter once the ice ladders were gone, and the fires along the wall's base had grown too fierce to cross, and the dark tide that had come boiling out of the tree line began, ragged and reluctant, to withdraw back into the forest, dragging its broken shapes with it. By the time the sky in the east began to gray, the wall stood as it had stood for 8,000 years, scarred and smoke-blackened but unbroken, and the men who'd fought on it stood along the parapet in the exhausted, hollow-eyed silence of soldiers who have survived something they hadn't quite believed they would. Jon took the ring off before anyone thought to look too closely at his hand. He was careful about that, this time, more careful than he'd managed to be beyond the wall, but it hardly mattered, because half of Castle Black had watched a bastard Lord Commander shatter 200 yards of animated ice with nothing but a gesture, and a look on his face like a man remembering something terrible, and no amount of careful hand-hiding was going to unmake that memory in the minds of the men who'd seen it. They buried 9 brothers that morning, in the hard ground near the shield hall that the Watch kept for exactly this purpose, and Jon said the words over each of them by name, because he'd learned that much at least from Maester Eamon and from his own dead, that a man's name mattered at the end, more than almost anything else did. Bowen Marsh found him afterward, alone at the edge of the burial ground, still holding the little book where he kept the names of every brother he'd sworn to lead, and increasingly every brother he'd had to bury. 9 dead, Marsh said quietly, and it would have been 9 dozen if not for whatever you did up there. I want you to know I understand that, Lord Snow. I'm not blind to what you did for this castle last night. But, Jon said, hearing the shape of the sentence before Marsh finished it, but I've served this watch since before you were born, and I've buried more brothers than I'll ever be able to name from memory, and I've never once in all those years seen anything like what happened up on that wall." Marsh's round face, usually so mild, was drawn tight with something that looked almost like grief. "The men are frightened, Lord Snow. Not of the Wights, they're used to being frightened of the Wights. That fear's familiar. It has a shape they know how to carry. They're frightened of you now, frightened in a new way. And frightened men in a besieged castle are men who start looking for someone to blame, or someone to control, or someone to be rid of before the thing they don't understand gets any bigger than it already is. What would you have me do, Bowen? Not fight. Let the wall fall so the men feel more comfortable." "No," Marsh said, and there was real weariness in it, the exhaustion of a decent man caught between two truths he couldn't reconcile. "I'd have you understand that saving us and frightening us aren't opposites, Lord Snow. A man can do both at once and often does, and it doesn't make either of them less true." He hesitated, then added, quieter still, "Sir Alizer's been talking to some of the older brothers. Not plotting, not yet. I'd tell you plainly if it were that, whatever else you think of me. But talking. Wondering aloud whether a commander wielding a magic none of us understand, that even the wildlings' old stories are frightened of, is still a commander sworn to the same watch the rest of us are sworn to, or something else wearing its colors." Jon closed the little book of names. Below them, in the courtyard, brothers were already at work repairing what the night had broken, mending the winch housing, hauling away burned timber, the ordinary grinding business of survival that never quite stopped no matter what horror the previous night had held. Ghost sat nearby, watching him with those unsettling red eyes, and Jon found himself wondering, not for the first time since the tomb, exactly how much of what he'd become in that fight had frightened even the wolf who'd never once been afraid of him before. "Tell Sir Alizer," Jon said finally, "that I fought for this castle last night, same as he did, same as every man who bled on that wall. Tell him whatever he wants to call what let me do it. The men who are alive this morning because of it can call it a mercy and leave it at that." "I'll tell him," Marsh said. "I don't know that it'll be enough." "It doesn't have to be enough for him," Jon said. "It has to be true, that's a different thing." Marsh left him there. Jon stood a while longer at the edge of the burial ground, the wind pulling at his cloak, and thought about Roderick Snow, a king dead 8,000 years, murdered by the very men he'd saved because the light he carried had grown too bright for them to bear standing next to it. He thought about the ring, locked once more in its chest, warm even through the cold iron and the black wool, patient the way ice was patient, the way the thing beyond the wall was patient, waiting to see what kind of man would finally wear it and never take it off again. He thought, too, about Stannis Baratheon, some from south on the King's Road at that very hour, riding north with an army and a red priestess and a claim to a throne, coming to a castle full of frightened brothers and a commander who had just, without meaning to, announced to the whole of Castle Black that he carried a power none of them, perhaps none of them anywhere in the Seven Kingdoms, had ever seen before. Stannis Baratheon, Jon knew from every account he'd ever heard of the man, was not the sort of king to see a power like that and simply leave it be. He went to find Sam. There was work to do before that particular storm arrived, and precious little time left to do it in. Chapter 3. A king comes north. Cotter Pike's Raven had said an army. It hadn't said what an army looked like coming up the King's Road in the gray light before dawn, banners heavy with frost, the golden stag of House Baratheon snapping stiff in a wind that had teeth in it, 3,000 men moving in the disciplined silence of soldiers who'd marched a long way and expected to march further still. Jon watched them come from the top of the wall, Ghost pressed against his leg, and thought that for all Stannis Baratheon's reputation as a hard, humorless, joyless man, There was something almost beautiful in the order of it, no straggling, no drunken laughter carrying up the road, just column after column moving like a single creature with a great many legs. "That's a king's army," Tormund said beside him, arms crossed against the cold. "Not a big one, but a proper one, trained. You can tell by how quiet they are, savages like us. We'd have half the column singing by now. You call yourselves savages when it suits you and free folk when it doesn't. Man's got to have options," Tormund said, and grinned, though his eyes stayed on the approaching banners with something less than his usual good humor. "That's the fella wants to be king of everything south of here. The one they say burned his own brother alive to steal a crown that wasn't his to steal. That's one version of the story. Which version's true?" Jon didn't answer, because he genuinely didn't know, and because the column had reached the gate by then, and there was no more time for guessing at the character of a man before that man was standing in front of him, close enough to read for himself. Stannis Baratheon dismounted in the courtyard of Castle Black like a man who'd been waiting his whole life to be somewhere colder and less comfortable than wherever he'd come from. He was leaner than Jon had expected, hollow through the cheeks, his beard cropped close, and his eyes set deep and dark under a heavy brow. A man built entirely out of duty and grievance, with almost nothing left over for anything else. Behind him came a stocky, gray-bearded knight with an easy, weathered face, and a missing finger joint that Jon noticed only because the man used that hand to gesture as he spoke. And beside Stannis, a step behind, and yet somehow always at the center of every eye in the yard, walked a woman in red. She was beautiful in the way fire is beautiful, striking to look at and dangerous to stand too close to. Red hair loose despite the cold, a ruby at her throat that seemed to catch light that wasn't there to catch. She looked at Jon the way a woman looks at a locked door she's fairly certain holds something valuable, and something in that look made the hair rise on the back of Jon's neck before either of them had spoken a single word. "Lord Commander Snow," Stannis said, without warmth, without preamble, the way a man addresses a subordinate rather than an equal. "I am told you're the reason this castle still stands. I'm told a great many other things besides. We'll discuss which of them are true." "Your Grace." Jon inclined his head, not a bow, not quite, and he saw Stannis notice the distinction and file it away, the way the man seemed to file everything away, cataloging debts and slights with the same grim thoroughness. "You're welcome at Castle Black. The Watch takes no side in the wars of the Seven Kingdoms, but we don't turn away men willing to fight the true enemy." "The true enemy." Stannis repeated the words as though testing their weight. "We shall see how true you believe that, Lord Snow, before this is finished." He glanced past Jon, at the scorched, ice-scarred stretch of wall visible from the courtyard, at the fresh mounds of earth near the shield hall that hadn't had time to settle yet. "I'm told something broke 200 yards of climbing ice apart with a gesture 5 nights past. I'm told the men who saw it are still frightened to speak of it plainly. I want to know what that something was." "That's a conversation for inside," Jon said, "not the yard, with respect, Your Grace." Stannis' jaw worked once, the closest thing to a reaction the man seemed capable of showing in public. "Fine," he said. "Inside, then." The gray-bearded knight fell into step beside Jon as they crossed the yard, and offered him a small, wry smile that had nothing of Stannis' grimness in it at all. "Davos Seaworth," he said. "Hand to his Grace for my sins. Don't let his manner trouble you overmuch. He'd greet the seven themselves the same way if they came asking favors. It's not unfriendliness. It's just the only gear he's got. You seem to like him well enough despite it." "I like him because he's the most honest man I've ever served," Davos said. "He'll never once tell you what you want to hear to smooth a path. Whatever else you think of him by the end of this, you'll know exactly where you stand with him, and in my experience that's worth more than charm in a king." He glanced sideways at Jon, curious rather than probing. "For what it's worth, lad, and I mean this kindly, Whatever you did up on that wall, don't let him talk you into thinking it makes you his to spend. I've watched him look at men that way before. Doesn't always end well for the men. The council chamber in the king's tower was too small for the number of people who wanted to be in it. Stannis, Davos, Melisandre, Jon. Sam standing quiet and useful against the wall with an armful of records nobody had asked for but that Jon had learned to bring him along for anyway. And Alliser Thorne, who'd insisted on his place at the table with a bluntness that even Stannis seemed to respect. 3,000 men, Stannis said, laying it out without ceremony, the way he seemed to do everything. I've taken Deepwood Motte and put the Boltons on notice, but the North is fractured. Half its great house is cowed or turned traitor, and I've neither the gold nor the numbers to hold what I've taken without more swords. The wildling army you broke, Lord Snow, I'm told a great many of them survived the battle and scattered rather than surrendered. Wildling men know how to fight in this cold better than any southern soldier I've brought north. I want them. I want them fighting under my banner, and I want the Night's Watch's word that it will not stand in the way of my bringing them south to do it. They're not mine to give you, Jon said, and I don't think you understand what you're asking. The free folk don't fight for kings. They fought Mance Rayder because he promised them a way south of a wall that's been killing their children with cold and starvation for 3 winters running. You want their swords, you'll have to give them something better than a banner to bleed under. I can give them land, loyal service, rewarded. You can give them their lives, Jon said, which is the only thing they were ever asking the Watch for in the first place, and which the Watch has been too frightened and too proud to give them for 1,000 years. That's the offer that'll move them, not yours. Thorne's mouth twisted at that, the old argument, resurfacing in front of a king now, and Jon could see him weighing whether to fight it out loud or let it pass. He let it pass, for now, though his eyes said the argument wasn't finished. Stannis studied Jon for a long moment with those deep-set, calculating eyes. You speak very plainly for a bastard sworn to have no opinions on the wars of kings. I have opinions on the survival of the people north of this wall, your grace. That's not the same war you're fighting, isn't it? Stannis leaned forward slightly. I mean to sit the Iron Throne because I am the rightful king, and because the alternative is a boy born of incest sitting it in my place while the realm rots around him. That is not vanity, Lord Snow. Whatever the singers say of me, it is arithmetic. A strong king in the south means a realm capable of sending men and grain north when the real war comes. A weak one means the north stands alone against whatever's coming, the way it's standing alone right now. So yes. I think my war and your war are the same war, whether you're willing to see it yet or not. It was, Jon had to admit privately, not a stupid argument. Stannis Baratheon was not a stupid man. That much was becoming clear within the first quarter hour of knowing him. But there was a particular danger in men who reasoned that clearly and that coldly toward conclusions that happened to serve them. And Jon had met enough of them in his short life to know better than to mistake sound logic for good intent. I'll consider what you've said, your grace, Jon said. But I make no promises on behalf of the free folk or on behalf of this watch, beyond what our oaths already require. We hold the wall. We fight what comes from beyond it. Everything else is yours to earn, same as it would be for any man. Melisandre had said nothing this whole time, sitting very still with her hands folded before her on the table, watching Jon with those unsettling pale eyes. But when he finished speaking, something in her expression shifted, subtle and unmistakable, a woman recalculating a sum she'd thought long settled. "May I ask a question, Lord Commander?" she said, and her voice had a low, accented music to it that made even ordinary words sound like the edge of a spell. "Not of politics, of you." "You can ask. Have you seen visions in fire?" she said. "Dreamed dreams that felt more true than waking? Heard the Lord of Light call your name in flame, or in blood, or in the space between one heartbeat and the next? No, Jon said honestly. None of that. Strange, Melisandre murmured almost to herself, because I have looked into Arlor's fire every night since crossing the wall's shadow, searching for the champion my god has promised the world, Azor Ahai reborn, wielder of the sword of fire that will drive back the endless night, and every night I have seen the same thing in those flames. A great darkness gathering in the north, and within that darkness, a small, strange, golden light that should not be there at all, a light my god's fire does not recognize and cannot explain, and which grows brighter each night I look for it. Her gaze didn't waver from Jon's face. I did not know, until I rode through your gate this morning, whose light I have been seeing. The chamber went very quiet. Sam, against the wall, had gone still in the particular way he did when he badly wanted to say something and was forcing himself not to. I don't know anything about your god's fire, my lady, Jon said, keeping his voice level. I know what I found beyond the wall, and I know it's helped me fight the thing that's actually coming for all of us. That's all I can tell you. That is not nothing, Melisandre said softly, but it is not an answer either. She turned to Stannis, and something passed between them, wordless and old, the particular shorthand of two people who'd built an entire understanding of the world together over years, and were now both, quietly, unsettled by a piece that didn't fit the pattern they'd built it from. Your Grace, this is not what I have seen before. This is not what I was promised. Promises change shape when men look at them from close enough, Stannis said, though there was, for the first time since he'd ridden through the gate, a flicker of something uncertain behind his eyes. We will speak of this later. He turned back to Jon, and whatever softness had briefly touched him hardened over again. There is another matter, Lord Snow, and I'll have it out now rather than let it sour between us. The Wildling King, Mance Rayder. Mance isn't here. I'm aware, Stannis said. My scouts report he survived the battle you fought before I arrived, and that he's rallying what remains of his broken host somewhere north and west of here, the Milkwater, most likely, or the ruins near the Fist of the First Men. I want him found. I want him brought to me, and when he stands before me, I intend to have his head, publicly, as a lesson to every other king who thinks himself entitled to march an army against the realm's peace. He said it without heat, the way he said everything, a fact laid on the table rather than a threat. That's a mistake, Jon said. Stannis' eyes narrowed. Careful, Lord Snow. I'll say it plainly, Your Grace, because you said you preferred plain speech. Mance Rayder is the one man alive who can bring what's left of 100,000 free folk south of that wall in good order, instead of scattering them to starve or freeze or die fighting each other over what's left. Kill him and you don't get a lesson. You get 100,000 desperate, leaderless people with nothing left to lose, coming at this wall from every direction at once, exactly when the real enemy is already testing our defenses from the other side of it. That's not justice, Your Grace. That's throwing away the one asset that could win you this war for the sake of a symbol. Something flickered across Stannis' face. Not agreement, not yet, but the specific stillness of a man who has just heard an argument he cannot immediately dismiss and resense being made to consider it. Davos, beside him, said nothing, but Jon caught the faint, approving crease at the corner of the old smuggler's eyes. I will consider that also, Stannis said finally, in a voice that made clear the conversation was over for now. But understand me, Lord Snow. I did not march 3,000 men to the end of the world to be told by every party I meet what I may and may not do with my own justice. If Mance Rayder will not kneel, he dies. That much does not change, whatever use you believe he might be to me alive. Then let me talk to him first, Jon said. Before you decide his fate for him, give me that much. Stannis studied him a long moment, measuring, Jon thought, not just the request but the man making it, weighing whether this was a bastard overreaching his place or something else entirely, something the king hadn't yet found the right name for. "You have a fortnight," Stannis said at last. "Bring him to kneel or bring me proof he never will, and I'll decide from there. Beyond that, Lord Snow, I'll remind you that a fortnight is a courtesy, not a right, and I do not extend courtesies twice." Sam caught Jon in the corridor afterward, practically vibrating with the effort of having held his tongue through the whole meeting. "She said your light doesn't match her fire," Sam said. "Jon, did you hear what she said? A woman who's supposedly seen a god's own visions in flame looked at whatever's inside you and told her king to his face that it isn't part of the prophecy she's built her whole life on. That's not a small thing. That's a priestess admitting her own scripture might be wrong in front of the king she serves. People like that don't admit things like that easily. I heard her, Sam. I don't think you understand how dangerous that makes you to her," Sam pressed. "If you're not the champion her God promised, if you're something outside the story entirely, then either the whole prophecy's broken, which she can't accept, or you're something the prophecy never accounted for and might, for all she knows, be working against it. Either way, Jon, a woman who burns people alive for her God isn't going to just shrug and move on from that. Then I'll have to convince her I'm not her enemy. How? I don't know yet," Jon admitted. "One thing at a time, Sam. Right now, I need to ride north before Stannis' fortnight runs out and decides the matter for me." He took Tormund and a dozen riders, and Ghost ran ahead of them the whole way, easier in his own skin now than he'd been since the tomb, as if the direwolf too had needed time to grow accustomed to whatever had changed in the man he ran beside. They found Mance's camp on the third day, strung out along a frozen tributary of the Milkwater in a ragged sprawl of tents and lean-tos, and cook fires too small and too few for the number of people huddled around them. Thousands, easily, though nothing like the great host that had marched on the wall before. War and cold and the long retreat had done what Jon's archers hadn't managed alone. They knew Tormund on sight, and word ran ahead of them through the camp faster than any horse could carry it. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that, but a low murmuring current of recognition that followed Jon specifically. Wherever he rode, men and women stepping out of tent flaps to watch him pass with the particular wide-eyed attention people give a story they'd heard secondhand and hadn't quite believed until they saw the thing standing in front of them. "They know," Tormund said quietly, riding close beside him. "Word travels faster than horses out here, Snow. Everybody this side of the walls heard by now what you did to that ice ladder. Some of them think you're a god. Some think you're cursed. Mostly, though," he grinned, "mostly they're just curious which one you'll turn out to be." Mance Rayder met them at the center of the camp, standing outside a tent no grander than any other, wrapped in a cloak patched together from a dozen different furs, his face thinner than Jon remembered from their one prior meeting, older, harder, but the sharp, appraising humor in his eyes hadn't dimmed one bit despite everything. "Lord Commander," Mance said, and there was an edge under the courtesy, old grievance not quite buried. "Come to finish what you started at the wall, bit far to ride just to gloat." "I came to talk." "Course you did." Mance's eyes flicked to Tormund, then back to Jon, then briefly, unmistakably, down to Jon's right hand, bare, ringless. But the way Mance looked at it told Jon the rumors had reached this camp fully intact. "You know, I spent 9 years in that black cloak of yours before I decided I'd rather freeze as a free man than live comfortable as a slave to a wall. I know every trick a crow's got up his sleeve for making a wildling feel small enough to bargain against his own interest. So before you start, Snow, whatever tale's been running ahead of you, whatever it is you did up on that wall, I want to see it. Not hear about it. See it. A man doesn't trade his people's future on rumor." Jon looked around the camp, the thin fires, the hollow faces, children wrapped in furs too big for them, watching him with the particular hunger of the truly desperate. He thought of Sam's warning of the ring locked safe back at Castle Black, and knew with a clarity that surprised him that he wasn't going to need it here at all. Whatever Mance wanted to see, it wasn't magic. It was proof of a different kind. "Ghost," Jon said quietly. The direwolf, who had been sitting silent and watchful at the camp's edge the whole time, rose and padded forward, unhurried, and sat directly at Jon's side, red eyes fixed on Mance without a trace of the animal wariness he'd shown any stranger since the tomb. "He's not tame," Jon said. "Never has been. He's killed men who threatened me and let men who didn't walk away without a scratch, and there's no leash on him, no collar, no trick to it. That's not magic, Mance. That's trust, earned the same slow way any man earns it. And I'm telling you plainly, because you asked plainly, that whatever I found beyond the wall doesn't change who I am or what I'm offering you. I'm not here to threaten your people into a bargain. I'm here because I killed 6 Wights with a blade in my hand a fortnight ago, and watched them stop moving the way anything living stops moving. And I know now, better than any Meister in this world, exactly how badly you and I both need each other before the thing that made those Wights decides it's done testing the wall and starts pulling it down instead." Mance was quiet a long moment, studying him, and studying Ghost, who hadn't moved, hadn't so much as bared a tooth, simply sat there with the calm, immovable patience of an animal utterly certain of the man beside him. "Stannis Baratheon wants my head," Mance said finally. "He does. I've bought you a fortnight to change his mind, and I mean to spend every day of it doing exactly that. But I won't lie to you about what he wants, because I've watched what happens to people who get lied to about kings before, and I won't do that to you or to your people. And if I say no, if I tell you my people would rather scatter and die free in this cold than march south under some southern king's banner to fight his wars for him, then I'll tell him that, and I'll tell him what it costs him to have you dead instead of leading them, and I'll keep fighting to hold this wall open for anyone who wants to come through it regardless of what banner they'll or won't fly." Jon met his eyes steadily. "I'm not here to make you kneel, Mance. Stannis wants that. I want your people alive on the right side of that wall when the real war starts, because I've seen what's coming, and I don't think it much cares whose crown a man swore to when the dead come walking." Something in Mance's face eased, fractionally, not trust, not yet, but the particular loosening of a man who has spent a long time braced for a blow that hasn't landed the way he expected it to. "You always did talk a good fight, Snow," Mance said. "Come on, then. Sit by my fire and eat something that isn't half frozen, and we'll talk about what your walls actually got waiting on the other side of it. Because from where I've been standing this past fortnight, it's a great deal worse than a broken ice ladder." They talked long into the night, Mance's fire small and smoky, and surrounded by a dozen wildling chiefs and elders who listened to every word with the flat, careful attention of people, deciding whether to gamble the last of what they had left. Mance told him things the Watch's rangers had never mapped: a growing dead quiet in the deep forest north of the Milkwater, whole clans that had simply stopped answering signal fires, a Skinchinger woman named Varamir who'd fled south a week past raving about the Night King himself walking among the ruins of Hardhome with an army at his back that stretched further than any eye could follow. "Hardhome," Jon repeated. "How many people?" "Thousands when I left it. More than thousands. Whole clans that never trusted me enough to march on your wall in the first place, gathered up along that coast because it's the last defensible ground this side of everything, and now—" Mance shook his head. "Now I don't know if there's anyone left there to save, or if I'd be sending you into a grave." "We'll find out," Jon said, "because if there's even a chance those people are still alive, I'm not leaving them to the dark to save an argument with a king about who kneels to whom." Tormund, across the fire, raised his cup in something between a toast and a challenge. "There it is," he said, grinning through his beard. Knew you weren't just a pretty face and a magic trick, Snow. All right. You want to sail into Hardhome and pull thousands of desperate, half-mad wildlings out from under the Night King's own nose. I'm coming, and I'll bring every fighting man in this camp who's got the stones for it. That's if Stannis lets me have the ships, Jon said. Or the men. Then you'd best make sure he does, Mance said. Because Snow, whatever you did on that wall, whatever's in that ring you're carrying that you're too careful to wear in front of strangers, none of it's going to matter a damn if the Night King reaches Hardhome before you do. That's not a fight you win with clever words to a king. That's a fight you win with ships and time, and neither of those things care what a bastard's proven himself capable of. Jon sat with that a long while, the fire small and low between them, the cold pressing in close on every side despite it, and thought of the ring locked away back at Castle Black, warm, patient, waiting, and of the vast, ancient attention that had turned toward him twice now from somewhere far to the north, unhurried, untroubled, certain of its own eventual victory, the way only something truly old could afford to be certain. He thought, too, of Melisandre's flame, and the golden light she'd seen inside it that her god's own fire didn't recognize. It doesn't have to recognize me, Jon thought, watching the smoke curl up into the dark toward a sky thick with unfamiliar stars. It just has to be afraid of me before this is finished. Around him, one by one, the wildling chiefs began drifting toward their tents, decisions half-made, alliances half-formed, and Mance Rayder sat by his dying fire a long while after the others had gone, watching Jon with the tired, wary respect of one hard man recognizing, however reluctantly, another. You know what frightens me most about you, Snow, Mance said finally low, almost to himself. What's that? Every king I've ever met wanted that ring the moment they heard about it, every single one. Kings are built out of wanting more, it's near enough the whole job description. He tossed the last of his cup's contents into the fire, watched it hiss and die. You're the first one I've ever met who seems like he'd rather it had never found him at all. I don't know yet if that makes you safer to trust, or more dangerous than any of the rest of them put together. Maybe it's both, Jon said. Mance said, and for the first time all evening, something like a real smile touched his weathered face. Maybe it is. Chapter 4, The Red Woman's Fear. They rode back into Castle Black on the 10th day of Stannis' fortnight, snow falling thick and steady, and Jon had 4 days left to either bring Mance Rayder to kneel or bring the king proof he never would. He had neither, not really. What he had was a half-formed understanding with a broken king of a broken people, and a growing certainty that the real war wasn't going to wait politely for anyone's deadline. Sam met him at the stables before he'd even finished handing off his horse, and one look at Sam's face told Jon that whatever news waited for him inside, none of it was going to be good. She's been asking after you every day, Sam said, keeping his voice low though there was no one close enough to hear. The Red Woman. She's had Clydas fetch her braziers up to the guest quarters, burns things at all hours, Jon, the smell alone's enough to make a man's eyes water 3 floors down. And Thorne's been meeting with Marsh and some of the older stewards in the evenings. Nothing I can prove, just meetings that stop the moment I walk past, conversations that go quiet. How many of the older brothers? 4, maybe 5 that I've noticed. Othel Yarwick's been at 2 of them. That worries me more than Thorne, honestly. Yarwick's not a hateful man. He's a practical one, and practical men doing something quietly usually means they've already decided it's necessary. Jon absorbed that the way he'd learned to absorb most bad news these days, filing it, not flinching from it, letting the cold settle into something he could work with rather than something that worked on him. Anything else? One more thing. Sam hesitated, and that hesitation alone told Jon it mattered. I found something in the old records, a fragment really, half-burned from before the Watch even kept proper rolls, mentions a commander thousands of years back who came into some kind of power the brothers didn't understand. Doesn't name what it was. Just says the watch dealt with it the way the watch deals with anything it fears it can't control. Sam swallowed. They didn't exile him, John. They killed him. In his sleep. Called it mercy in the record. Said a man who'd stopped being a man had no business commanding men anymore. You think that's what Thorne's planning? I think Thorne genuinely, honestly believes he's protecting the watch, Sam said. That's what frightens me about it. He's not wrong that a commander with power nobody else can match or even understand is dangerous to an institution built entirely on every brother being equal under the same oath. I just think he's wrong about what to do with that fear. Melisandre found him that same evening in the practice yard, alone, working through sword forms in the last gray light before full dark, not because he needed the practice, not anymore, but because his body had learned over years that moving with a blade in his hand was the only thing that quieted the noise in his head, and lately there was a great deal of noise. You fight the same, she observed from the edge of the yard, wrapped in a heavy cloak that did nothing to dim the vividness of her hair against the snow. I watched you before I knew what you carried. You fight exactly the same now as you did then. That troubles me, Lord Snow, more than I think you understand. Why would it trouble you that I haven't changed? Because power always changes a man's movements, even when it doesn't change his heart, Melisandre said, drifting closer, unhurried, the way she seemed to move through every room she entered as though the room itself had been waiting for her. I have watched our lords touch settle over men before. It makes them larger in their own eyes, prouder in their stance. Even the humble ones begin in small ways to carry themselves like something has chosen them because something has, and a man cannot help but feel the weight of being chosen. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with those unsettling, ancient eyes. You carry yourself exactly as you did before you found whatever you found beyond that wall. No pride in it. No weight, even. That is either the deepest humility I have ever witnessed in a man who has touched true power, or it is something else entirely, and I confess, Lord Snow, I do not yet know which. Maybe it's neither, Jon said, sheathing his sword. Maybe I just don't see much point in feeling chosen by a thing I didn't ask for and don't fully understand. Every man who has ever been given power says something like that at the start. Her voice softened, and for a moment the priestess fell away, and something more genuinely uncertain showed through underneath. I have given my whole life to a single belief, Lord Commander, that the Lord of Light has chosen a champion to stand against the dark, that the signs would show me his face when the time came, that fire itself would confirm it beyond any doubting. I burned men on that belief. I killed a king's own nephew on that belief, screaming his innocence, and told myself the gods' purpose justified the blood because I had seen it, truly seen it in the flames. She looked away from him, out toward the darkening tree line beyond the wall, and her voice, when it came again, was smaller than he'd ever heard it. And now I look into that same fire every night and I see your light in it, and it does not answer my prayers. It does not confirm anything. It simply is. Burning where it wants, how it wants, indifferent to every question I put to it. I do not know how to serve a God whose signs have stopped speaking a language I understand. Jon studied her for a long moment. There was something almost unbearably lonely in what she just admitted. A woman who'd built an entire self out of certainty now standing at the edge of a doubt she couldn't outrun. And despite everything, despite the men he knew she'd burned, despite Thorne's warnings, despite his own instinct to keep this woman as far from the ring as he could manage, he found he couldn't quite bring himself to feel triumphant about her fear. It felt instead like looking at Roderick Snow's crown, at a story about power finding the wrong hands and burning everyone near it regardless of intention. Maybe your God's not wrong, Jon said finally. Maybe he's just telling you something you don't want to hear yet. That the world doesn't fit as neatly into chosen, and not chosen as you built your whole faith around believing. That there's things in it older than your fire and colder than your dark, and they don't care whose prophecy they're supposed to fit into. That is a heresy, Lord Snow, from a man who has never once prayed to my God in his life. Maybe. Or maybe it's just what a bastard sees, standing where I've stood the last fortnight. He met her eyes steady. I didn't ask for this ring. I didn't ask to be seen by whatever's out there beyond the wall. And I sure as hells didn't ask for a red priestess to look into her fire and find me staring back at her instead of whoever she was hoping for. But I'll tell you the one thing I do know, plainer than anything your flames have shown you. Whatever's coming for all of us doesn't care about your God or mine. It doesn't care about crowns or prophecies or which king sits which throne. It only cares about ending, and it's patient enough to wait us all out if we spend the next winter arguing about which of us is the chosen one, instead of fighting the thing that's actually coming. Melisandre was silent a long while, the wind picking up around them, snow beginning to drift sideways across the practice yard. "You sound," she said finally, "like a man who has already decided he does not need to be anyone's champion to do what needs doing." "Maybe I have." "That," Melisandre said softly, "is either the wisest thing I have heard a man say in 20 years of chasing prophecy, or it is the single most dangerous thing, because a man who does not need to be chosen answers to no one but himself." She drew her cloak tighter and turned to go, but paused at the edge of the yard, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between fear and unexpectedly respect. "I will be watching you carefully, Lord Snow. Not because I believe you my enemy, because I no longer know what you are, and not knowing is the one thing I have never learned to bear gracefully." Bowen Marsh came to Jon's chambers 2 nights later, alone, no thorn beside him this time, and stood in the doorway wringing his hands in a way that told Jon everything he needed to know before the man said a single word. "Sit down, Bowen. I can't stay long." Marsh didn't sit. His round face had gone gray, sleepless, a man carrying something too heavy for the frame he had to carry it in. "I came because I've spent 30 years telling myself the watch stands for something worth the cold and the killing and the burying of men before their time, and I don't know how to reconcile that with what I've heard discussed these past nights, and I thought, God help me, that maybe telling you was the only honest thing left for me to do." "Tell me then." "There's talk," Marsh said, the words coming fast now like a dam breaking. "Not from me. I want that understood, Lord Snow. Whatever comes of this, I've not raised a hand against you, not spoken in favor of raising one. But Sir Alizer has spoken with others. Yarwick, a few of the older stewards who remember what the histories say happened the last time a commander wore power the watch couldn't account for. They believe, Alizer believes, that you can no longer be trusted to command men who don't understand what you've become, that keeping the ring locked in your chest and refusing to explain it to your own officers is itself a kind of tyranny, however gently meant. He means to take it from you. Tonight, while you sleep. Not to kill you, Lord Snow. He was clear on that point, insistent on it even, said he wasn't Roderick Snow's murderers and had no wish to be remembered as such, only to take the ring, and put you somewhere safe until the watch can decide, as a body, what ought to be done with a commander who carries something like that. Something cold and very still settled over Jon, hearing that, not fear exactly, but a kind of grim, weary recognition, the shape of the thing he'd half expected since the moment he'd felt Thorne's eyes on him atop the burning wall. "When?" "Tonight," Marsh said again. "An hour past the changing of the middle watch. He'll have 4 men with him. He asked me to be a 5th. I told him I needed to think on it." Marsh's voice cracked, just slightly. "I came here instead, Lord Snow, because whatever else I am, I don't believe I can live with myself if I let this happen in silence, and I don't believe truly, I don't, that Alizer Thorn is wrong to be afraid. I only believe he's chosen the wrong way to answer that fear." Jon was quiet a moment, weighing what to do with what he'd just been handed: a man's confession, a man's fear, and the bones of a mutiny laid bare in his own chambers by the very steward whose loyalty he'd never been entirely certain of. "Thank you for telling me, Bowen. What will you do?" "Nothing that gives Sir Alizer a reason to be more afraid of me than he already is," Jon said. "Go back to your quarters. Say nothing to him of this conversation. Let me handle the rest." He didn't sleep that night, not really. He lay in his bed with his eyes closed and Longclaw within easy reach and Ghost stretched across the doorway exactly as always, and waited, counting the turning of the watch by the sounds of the castle settling into its usual restless quiet. The ring sat locked in its chest at the foot of the bed. He did not put it on. That, he decided somewhere in the hours since Marsh left him, was the whole point of what came next. That whatever happened tonight had to happen with him exactly as he was. No borrowed sharpness. No unnatural speed. Because if Thorn's fear was that the ring made him something other than a man his brothers could trust, then the only honest answer to that fear was to face it as nothing more than the man he'd always been. He heard them a little before the appointed hour, soft footsteps in the corridor outside, more than one set, moving with the deliberate care of men trying very hard not to be heard and not quite managing it. Ghost's ears came up. Jon put a hand on the wolf's head, quiet, still, and Ghost settled again, though his eyes stayed open, fixed on the door. The door opened slowly. Thorn came first, sword sheathed but hand near the hilt, and behind him 3 others Jon recognized by their shapes in the dark before he recognized their faces, Yarwick and 2 younger brothers Jon knew only by name. Men who'd taken their vows the same year he had and clearly believed, whatever else was true, that they were doing something necessary tonight rather than something shameful. "Sir Alizer," Jon said from the bed, not moving, his voice pitched calm and level into the dark. "You'll want to shut that door before you say whatever you came here to say. No sense waking the whole tower." There was a long, frozen silence. Thorn, Jon could see even in the dim light, had not expected to find him awake, sitting up, watching them with no fear in his face at all. "You know why we're here," Thorn said finally, quiet. "I do. Bowen told me." Something flickered across Thorn's face, not surprise exactly, more a grim confirmation of something he'd already half suspected about the steward's nerve. "Then you know we're not here to kill you, Lord Snow, whatever else you think of us for this. We mean you no harm. We mean the ring in that chest and nothing more. And once you have it, what then, Sir Alizer? You lock it away somewhere you think is safer than my keeping, and you tell the watch its Lord Commander's been relieved of duty for a crime that amounts to surviving something none of you fully understand. You think that holds the watch together better than trusting me has." "I think," Thorn said, and his voice had real heat in it now, the frustration of a man who'd spent 30 years believing certain things about duty and discipline, and was watching every one of them get tested past what he could bear. "That I have buried more brothers this past fortnight than I buried in the 5 years before it, and every one of those graves has your name somewhere near the reason for it. I think a power that shatters 200 yards of enchanted ice with a look, and makes grown men flinch away from it, is not a power any single man ought to hold alone, bastard or trueborn, good heart or bad. I think Roderick Snow's own history should have taught you that lesson before I ever had to come here to teach it to you myself." "Maybe it did teach me," Jon said. "Maybe that's exactly why I haven't worn it since the wall fight, why it's locked in that chest instead of on my hand right now, why I've told no one outside this room what it can do beyond what they've already seen with their own eyes in a fight for their lives. You think I don't understand what happened to him? I understand it better than any of you, Sir Alizer, because it's my name too, near enough, and I've thought about little else since Leathers read that inscription off the stone." Thorn hesitated. Behind him, the two younger brothers exchanged an uncertain glance in the dark, men who'd come prepared for a fight, or for a surrender, and were finding neither. "Then give it to us willingly," Thorn said. "Prove what you're claiming. Let the Watch decide together what's done with it, instead of one man alone in a locked chest holding a power that could, for all any of us truly know, turn on all of us the moment it decides you're not the man it wants anymore." Jon rose from the bed, slow, deliberate, unarmed, and crossed the room toward the chest, and every man in that doorway went taut, hands drifting to hilts, the moment's piece balanced on a knife's edge. He knelt, unlocked it, and lifted the ring out into the pale moonlight from the window, holding it not toward himself but out, toward Thorn in his open palm. "Take it then," Jon said. "If that's truly what you believe needs doing, take it now with your own hand and see what it does to you when you try." Thorn stared at the ring lying warm and gold and utterly unremarkable in Jon's open palm, and did not move. "You're not testing my courage, Sir Alizer," Jon said quietly. "You're testing your own certainty, and you already know, standing there, that you don't actually want to find out what happens if you're wrong about what it'll do to a man who takes it in hate, or fear, or the desire to control something rather than simply protect it. That's the whole difference between what I did with it and whatever you're afraid I'll do with it. I picked it up dying, with no thought in my head but living long enough to save the men beside me. You'd be picking it up armed, in the dark, against a man you've decided is dangerous. And I don't think, in your heart, you actually believe that's the kind of hand it was ever meant to reward." The silence stretched long enough that one of the younger brothers shifted his weight uneasy, and somewhere below in the yard a dog barked once and went quiet. "Put it away," Thorn said finally, low, almost strangled with the effort of the words. "Put it away, Snow, and I'll think on what you've said. That's all I'll promise you tonight." "That's enough," Jon said, and closed his hand around the ring, and set it back in the chest, and locked it, without ever once raising his voice or reaching for a weapon or giving the men in his doorway a single moment of the fight they'd braced themselves to have. Thorn turned to go, and the others with him, but he paused at the threshold, looking back at Jon with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from certainty into something far more uncomfortable, the specific unease of a man who has just watched his own convictions fail to survive contact with the person he'd built them against. "For what it's worth," Thorn said, "I don't hate you, Snow. Never did, not truly, whatever I let you believe all these years. I just never trusted the world to let a good man keep a thing like that and stay good for long. I've watched it happen too many times in too many stories to believe you'd be the exception." "Maybe I won't be," Jon said, "but you'll have to watch and see, Sir Alizer, same as the rest of us, because locking it away tonight in a different chest wasn't ever going to change that answer. Only time was." Thorn left without another word. Jon stood alone in the dark a long while after the door closed, hands still faintly warm where the ring had rested in his open palm, and thought that he had just won something tonight far more fragile and far more valuable than a fight. He had won, for the first time since the tomb, a moment where fear had looked directly at power and chosen, however reluctantly, not to strike. He did not report the mutiny. He told no one but Sam, sworn to silence, and made certain word reached Bowen Marsh through no channel that could be traced back to a confession, that no punishment would fall on any man who'd stood in that doorway that night. It was, he thought, the only answer that made any sense. A man who met an attempted betrayal with mercy instead of blood was making an argument about himself far louder than any speech could have made, and he suspected, rightly, that every man who'd stood in that room would spend a long time turning that particular silence over in his mind, wondering what kind of commander chose it, and why. Stannis summoned him 3 days later, the fortnight's end drawing close, and this time the meeting was private, no thorn, no council table crowded with officers, just Stannis and Davos and Jon in the king's borrowed chambers, a single brazier burning low against the cold. "You've bought Mance Rayder more time than I promised him," Stannis said, without preamble, "and I've heard nothing yet that tells me he means to kneel. He means to fight beside you, your grace, which I'd argue is worth a great deal more than kneeling, if you're honest about what you actually need from him." "I have been honest, Lord Snow, about very little else in my life." Something almost like dry humor touched the corner of Stannis's mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "I did not summon you to argue that point again, however. I have another matter to put before you, and I want your full attention on it, not half of it spent arguing for wildlings." "You have it." Stannis studied him a long moment, the way he seemed to study everything, weighing costs before committing to a single word. "The North is leaderless," he said finally. "The Boltons hold Winterfell by treachery and murder, and every great house in the North that hasn't bent the knee to them out of fear is waiting, watching, for someone worth rallying behind. I have the claim of law on my side, and 3,000 men, and precious little else that speaks to northern hearts the way blood does. You, Lord Snow, are Eddard Stark's son in every way that matters to the men who'd have to follow you, his face, his manner, his name near enough to carry the weight of it even bastard-born. And now, beyond that, you carry something I have never seen the like of in my life, something that broke an army of the dead apart with a gesture." "You're offering to legitimize me," Jon said, seeing where this was headed before Stannis finished laying the path to it. "I am offering you Winterfell," Stannis said, flat direct, the way he offered everything. "Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, sworn to my throne and mine alone, and every northern house that's ever bled for House Stark rallying to that name the moment it's spoken with a royal seal behind it. You bring me the North's swords and the North's loyalty, and whatever that ring of yours can do besides, and in exchange I give you back everything your birth denied you, a name, a house, a seat, a life beyond that black cloak you've worn since you were younger than you ought to have been made to wear it." It was, Jon had to admit, standing there in the low brazier light, the single most tempting offer any man had ever laid in front of him. Everything he'd wanted as a boy, watching Robb ride south to become Lord of Winterfell while he stayed behind at the wall with nothing but a borrowed name, offered now freely by a king who needed him badly enough to hand it over without even making him beg for it. "And the ring," Jon said, "what does it become in that arrangement? Mine still, or yours to command through me?" "It becomes a weapon of the realm," Stannis said, "the same as any sword or castle or army sworn to my throne. I do not ask you to hand it to another man's hand, Lord Snow. I've no wish to see what happens if it's wrong for anyone else the way it was so plainly right for you. I ask only that whatever it can do, it does in service of restoring order to a kingdom that is tearing itself apart while a greater enemy gathers strength. Beyond a wall, too, few men are watching closely enough. Is that so unreasonable a price for everything I am offering to give you in return?" Jon was quiet a long moment, and in that silence he thought of a great many things at once, of Winterfell's gates, of a name that had never truly been his, of Sansa and Arya and Bran and Rickon scattered across a broken kingdom, of the particular ache of a boy who'd grown up watching his father's love divided unevenly between him and his siblings by nothing but the accident of a wedding vow that had never been made. He thought, too, of Roderick Snow, dead 8,000 years, murdered by men who'd feared exactly the kind of unchecked bargain Stannis was describing now, power-bound to a crown, answerable only to a king's use of it. "No," Jon said. Stannis' expression did not change quite, but something behind his eyes went very still and very cold. "No," he repeated, testing the word. "I'll fight beside you, your grace, and gladly, because the thing coming for all of us doesn't care whose banner we're standing under when it arrives. I'll give you everything I have to give against that enemy freely, because it's the only fight that's ever mattered to me since I first understood what this wall was actually built to hold back. But I won't take Winterfell as a price for that fight, and I won't hand you or any other man command over what this ring does, because the moment I do that, it stops being a shield the realm can trust and starts being exactly the kind of weapon men have always feared it might become, one man's will, wearing another man's crown for cover." "You would refuse your own father's seat," Stannis said. "Your own birthright, restored to you at no cost but loyalty you already owe the realm regardless." "It's not at no cost, your grace. You know that better than most men alive. You've spent your whole life paying the cost of a crown you believe is rightfully yours, and I've watched what that cost's done to the men and women closest to you. I don't want Winterfell as a gift from a king who needs what I carry. If I ever sit in my father's seat, I want it because the North itself calls me there freely, the way it called my father before me, not because a king from the South decided my power was worth buying with a name." Davos, silent throughout the whole exchange, was watching Jon now with an expression Jon couldn't quite read, something between astonishment and, very quietly, a kind of relief. Stannis' jaw worked once, twice, the muscles standing out along it, a king absorbing a refusal he had genuinely not expected to receive. "You understand," he said finally low, "that I have never once offered any man what I just offered you. Not gold, not glory, a name, a seat, a birthright restored. Most men would kill for a tenth of what I put on that table. I know it, your grace. And I know exactly what that tells you about the ring, and about me. And I'd ask you to sit with that a while before you decide it's a problem, instead of the very thing you should be grateful for." Jon held the king's gaze steadily. "You've spent this whole conversation testing whether power like mine can be bought. I just answered that question for you plainly, and for free. Whatever's coming for this realm, your grace, it's not coming for a throne. It's coming for everyone sitting anywhere near one. I'd rather you understood that I mean to fight it because it's right, not because you found a way to make it profitable for me to do so." Stannis said nothing for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier hardness, replaced by something wearier, older. "Sir Davos tells me from time to time that I mistake a man's usefulness for the whole of his worth. I did not believe him most days." He glanced at Davos, who offered nothing but a small, careful nod. "Perhaps, Lord Snow, I have just been shown the difference in person." He straightened, the moment closing over, the king reasserting himself. "You have 3 days left of your fortnight. Bring me Mance Raider's answer one way or the other. That much at least has not changed." "It hasn't," Jon agreed and took his leave. Outside in the corridor, Melisandre was waiting. Whether by chance or design, Jon couldn't tell, though little about the Red Priestess struck him any more as purely coincidental. "I heard," she said simply, before he could ask how much of the conversation had carried through the door. "Or enough of it. You refused a crown tonight, Lord Snow. A name, a seat, everything a bastard is taught to want his whole life and told he'll never have." She studied him in the torchlight with an expression that had shifted again, subtly, into something new, not quite trust, but something adjacent to it, the beginning of a different kind of understanding. "I have spent my whole life believing the Lord of Light's champion would be a man consumed by his purpose, burning so bright the whole world would have no choice but to see him. I begin to wonder now, watching you, whether I had that entirely backward. Whether the fire that matters most in the end is the one that refuses to consume the man carrying it at all. I'm not your champion, my lady. I've told you that already." "Perhaps not," Melisandre said. But I no longer believe you are my enemy either, and for a woman who has spent 20 years certain of everything, Lord Snow, that uncertainty is, strangely, the closest thing to peace I have felt in a very long time." She inclined her head, something almost like respect in the gesture, and turned to go, then paused, glancing back at him once more. "Bring him alive, the wildling king. Whatever quarrel my king has with him, I think the fire I've been watching wants him breathing when the true dark finally comes. That much, at least, I am still certain of." Jon watched her go, the torchlight catching the red of her hair as she disappeared down the corridor, and thought, not for the first time since the tomb, that the ring on his finger, or more precisely, the choice never to let it change who reached for it, was proving to be a stranger, subtler kind of weapon than any blade he'd ever carried. It had made Stanny's pause. It had made Thorn falter in the dark rather than strike. It had made a woman who burned kings' nephews for prophecy stand in a cold corridor and admit, out loud, that her certainty had cracked. He had 3 days left, a wildling king's fate still to settle, and somewhere far to the north, past every argument being fought inside these walls, a patient and ancient will was gathering its strength at a place called Hardhome, utterly indifferent to which king wore which crown, or which bastard carried which ring, or which of them, in the end, believed themselves prepared for what was coming. Chapter 5. The long night answers. Cotter Pike gave Jon 4 ships and didn't hide how little he liked doing it. "Eastwatch can spare 4, he said, standing on the dock with his arms crossed against a wind that smelled of salt and coming ice. "And not because I think this is wise, Lord Snow, but because you're the only man who's ever asked me for ships instead of demanding them, and that buys you something, even from a bastard like me who's buried too many good sailors to trust a fool's errand easy. It's not a fool's errand if there are people alive to bring back. It's a fool's errand either way if there's nothing left of Hardhome but bones by the time you get there." Pike spat over the rail into the gray water. "But go on, then. Take your ships. Take your wildlings. I'll have hot food and dry beds waiting for whoever makes it back." Mance came with him. That argument, at least, had settled itself faster than Jon expected. Stannis had listened to Jon's account of the camp on the Milkwater, weighed against Davos's quiet counsel and his own cold arithmetic, and arrived, grudgingly, at the conclusion that a live wildling king leading thousands of desperate survivors into his service was worth more than a dead one making a point. He hadn't asked for Mance to kneel. He'd simply said, when the man was finally brought before him under guard, "Bring me your people alive and fighting, and we'll discuss what you owe me after, when there's a kingdom left worth owing anything to," which was, Jon thought, about as close to mercy as Stannis Baratheon's particular grammar of kingship allowed him to get. Tormund came too, and 40 of his best fighters, and 100 of the Watch's most seasoned rangers, and Ghost paced the deck of the lead ship the whole voyage north, with his hackles never fully settling, red eyes fixed on a horizon that grew colder and stranger the further they sailed. They reached Hardhome on a morning gray as unpolished iron, and the first thing Jon understood, before the ships had even finished dropping anchor in the ash-choked bay, was that they'd arrived too late for gentleness and just in time, maybe, for everything else. Smoke hung low over the ruined fishing village, black columns rising from a dozen separate fires, and the shore itself was chaos. Thousands of free folk crowded along the rocks and the broken piers, screaming, fighting each other for space on what few boats remained, while behind them at the tree line where the forest met the settlement's ragged edge, something vast and pale and patient stood among the shadows, unhurried, watching, exactly the way it had watched the wall. 7 hells, Tormund breathed, staring at the shoreline. "There's more of them than I've ever seen gathered in one place in my whole life." "Get the ships in as close as the water allows," Jon called back across the deck. "Every boat we've got, In the water now, women and children first, then the fighting men, then anyone still standing. Tormund, take 20 men and hold the pier. I'll take the rest and hold the line at the tree line. You'll hold the line, Tormund repeated, and there was no argument in it, only a grim, fast-moving certainty. A man who'd seen enough by now to know exactly what Jon meant by that and exactly how literally to take it. Jon went ashore in the first boat, Longclaw already in hand, and the moment his boots hit the rocky beach he understood the scale of what was actually happening. Not a raid, not a probe like the one at the wall, but a slow, deliberate slaughter, the dead advancing at the edges of the crowd in ones and twos, picking off the stragglers, the old, the slow, while the mass of survivors pressed screaming toward boats that could not possibly hold them all. He put the ring on without hesitation this time. There was no debate left in him about it, no careful weighing of Sam's warnings against the cost of restraint. There were children on that beach, and something ancient and patient was killing them one at a time from the shadows, and Jon Snow had stopped, somewhere in the last fortnight, needing anyone's permission to be exactly as dangerous as the moment required. The world sharpened. The cold clarity dropped over him like a held breath, and this time, for the first time, he didn't just feel that vast, ancient attention notice him from a distance. He felt it here, close, present, watching from the tree line with an intelligence that had absolutely nothing human left in it and never had. "Fall back to the water," Jon shouted, and his voice carried strangely far across the noise and panic, cutting through it the way a bell cuts through fog. Everyone fall back to the boats now. He ran at the tree line. He was aware, distantly, of men shouting behind him, of ghosts tearing past him low and fast toward the same shadows, and he was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with his eyes, of exactly where the dead were emerging from the dark, and exactly how many of them there were, hundreds at least, more pouring out of the forest with every heartbeat. And behind them, further back, further wrong, thousands more that hadn't been free folk at all in a very long time. Ancient dead risen from ground that had been killing fields for the others since long before the wall existed. The first wave hit him, and he went through it the way a scythe goes through wheat. There was no wasted motion in him now. None at all. Longclaw moved in patterns that had stopped being learned technique and become something closer to instinct sharpened past the edge of what a merely mortal body could achieve. And every stroke found the exact seam in the cold magic holding each wight together, unraveling it. And where his blade didn't reach fast enough, something else did. A pulse of raw, golden heat rolling off him in waves, melting the ice-crusted ground beneath his boots, making 3 wights that came too close simply crumble apart from the inside, as whatever animated them recoiled from proximity to him like flesh from flame. "Behind you, Lord Snow," one of the rangers screamed, and Jon spun without needing the warning, already moving, already knowing, and cut down 2 more before the ranger had even finished the sentence. He held that stretch of shoreline alone, effectively, for the better part of 10 minutes, long enough for Tormund's men to get the boats loaded, long enough for the screaming crowd to thin from a mob into an organized, if terrified, evacuation, long enough that even the hardest of the wildling fighters who'd fought at the wall against Jon's own men, not 4 months past, began shouting his name across the chaos like something between a battle cry and a prayer. Then the wights fell back, all at once, the way water pulls back before a wave, and Jon understood with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the ring and everything to do with simple animal instinct, that something worse was coming to take their place. It stepped out of the tree line slowly, unhurried, the way it did everything, tall as a man and taller, its flesh the color of old ice, its eyes a burning, impossible blue that seemed to hold winter itself trapped somewhere behind them. It wore no crown, carried no weapon, needed neither, And when it looked at Jon across 40 feet of blood-soaked shoreline, the whole world seemed to hold its breath around the moment. You should not exist. The thought arrived in Jon's mind, not spoken, not quite, but understood, ancient and vast and utterly without malice in the way a glacier has no malice for the village it crushes. Simply weight, simply inevitability, simply the plain fact of an old law meeting something that had broken it. Fire always burns itself out. That is the shape of every war I have ever fought and won. You do not burn out. That is wrong. That has always been wrong since the first night I felt you touch the edge of my reach. Maybe your wars just never met the right fire before, Jon said aloud, and did not know until he heard himself say it that he believed it. The Night King moved. It was faster than anything that size had any right to be, closing the distance in 3 strides, and Jon met it with L'Enclos raised. And the impact when blade met whatever passed for the creature's flesh sent a shock up through Jon's whole arm that felt less like striking a body, and more like striking the side of a mountain that had briefly, contemptuously, decided to bleed. Frost exploded outward from the point of contact, and Jon was thrown back a dozen feet, skidding across the ice-slick rock, and came up already moving because stopping, even for a heartbeat, felt like it would be the last mistake he ever made. They fought across that shoreline in a way that had no poetry in it, no elegance, just brutal, grinding, desperate exchange. Jon's speed and the ring's terrible clarity against a raw, patient, ancient strength that seemed to draw on the cold itself as its endless well. Ice crawling up from the ground with every blow the Night King landed, frost spreading across Jon's skin, faster than his own borrowed heat could burn it away. Jon, Tormund's roar from somewhere behind, and Jon caught, in the split second he dared spare for it, the sight of the last boats pulling away from the pier loaded well past sensible capacity, Mance himself standing at the stern of one, shouting something Jon couldn't hear over the fighting. Good, Jon thought. That's enough. That's what mattered. The Night King struck him again, and this time the blow connected fully, catching him across the chest and throwing him a full 20 feet through the air to crash into the frozen rubble of a collapsed fishing hut. And for one long, terrible moment the world went white and silent and very far away, ribs screaming, breath gone, the ring's warmth the only thing anchoring him to a body that felt, for the first time since the tomb, genuinely close to breaking. You will die here, the thought pressed into his mind again, closer now, almost gentle in its certainty, the way a much older thing speaks to a much younger one it has already decided has run its course. You are strong, stronger than anything I have faced in 10,000 years of patient waiting. But you are still only a man wearing a light that does not belong to this world, and men end. Everything that burns ends. Jon pushed himself up off the broken stone, blood in his mouth, ribs grinding wrong beneath his ruined leathers, and found, somewhere underneath the pain, something that felt less like defiance and more like simple, exhausted clarity. Maybe, he said, spitting blood, forcing himself back onto unsteady feet, but I'm not finished yet, and neither is everyone I just got off that beach. He didn't win that fight. That was the truth of it, plain and unglamorous. The Night King broke off before either of them could finish it, withdrawing back toward the tree line with the same unhurried patience it had arrived with, its burning blue eyes fixed on Jon the whole way, and Jon understood, watching it go, that it hadn't retreated out of fear. It had retreated because it had learned what it came to learn, and had no further use, for now, in spending its strength against something that refused, however battered, however close to broken, to simply lie down and die the way every fire before it always eventually had. Ghost found him a few minutes later, limping and bloodied himself, and pressed hard against Jon's side while Tormund's men carried Jon down to the last boat, the shoreline behind them already crawling with a fresh wave of the dead reclaiming what had briefly, desperately been a place of refuge. They'd gotten most of them out. Not all. Never all. Jon would carry the ones they hadn't reached in time for the rest of his life, the way he carried every grave he'd ever had to leave unfinished. But thousands lived who would not have lived otherwise. And Mance Rayder stood at the rail of the lead ship as the coastline receded into smoke and distance, watching Jon being carried below deck with an expression that had, sometime in the last hour, finally settled entirely on the far side of doubt. He woke 2 days later aboard ship, with Sam's worried face the first thing he saw and the Meister's assistant Clyda's hovering behind him with a poultice that smelled like it had been invented specifically to punish the sick for the crime of getting hurt. "You're an idiot," Sam informed him without preamble. A brave idiot, an idiot who saved thousands of people, but an idiot nonetheless, and I want that noted before you say anything heroic and dismissive about your own ribs. How bad? 3 broken, one of them badly enough that Clydas thought it might have punctured something important, except it didn't, because apparently whatever's in you doesn't just make you dangerous in a fight. It makes you heal like nothing I've ever read about in any medical text in that library, which is either wonderful or deeply unsettling depending on how much sleep I've had. Sam adjusted his spectacles. "You've been out 2 days. Mance has been in to see you 4 times. Tormund's told the story of that fight to every single person on this ship at least twice, and it's already grown taller than it was the first time he told it, which is saying something because it started out enormous. And the ring, still on your hand," Sam said quietly. "You didn't take it off, even unconscious. I don't know if that's significant. I thought you should know." Jon looked down at his right hand, the gold band warm against skin that ached everywhere else, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't feel any urge to remove it now. Whatever line had existed before, the careful, deliberate separation between the man and the power, the discipline he'd built out of fear of becoming something like Roderick Snow, felt, in the aftermath of Hardhome, less like wisdom and more like a luxury the war could no longer afford him. "We're needed at the wall," Jon said, pushing himself upright despite Clydas's immediate protest. "That thing didn't retreat because it lost, Sam. It retreated because it learned what it wanted to learn. It's coming, and it's coming with everything it's got. And I'd rather be standing on that wall when it arrives than lying in this bed feeling sorry for my own ribs." They reached Castle Black 4 days later, and the castle they returned to was already a castle bracing for something it could feel coming the way animals feel a storm before the first cloud appears. The sky to the north had taken on a strange, heavy quality, snow falling harder and colder than any winter storm Jon had ever seen, and every man on the wall's parapet stood his watch with the particular tense, listening silence of people who no longer needed to be told the enemy was close. Stannis had used the fortnight well, whatever else could be said of him. His 3,000 men had been drilled hard into the Watch's own defensive lines, oil stores replenished, the winches and the great gate reinforced with everything Bowen Marsh's stewards could scavenge. Melisandre met Jon at the gate herself, something in her face that hadn't been there before Hardhome, not quite fear, but a kind of grim, settled resolve. A woman who'd finally stopped arguing with her own doubt and decided instead to simply do what needed doing regardless of whose light guided her. "I burned 3 fires last night," she said without preamble, walking beside him as he made his slow, still healing way up toward the king's tower. 3 separate fires, 3 separate hours, and every single one showed me the same thing. It is coming tonight, Lord Snow. Not tomorrow, not in a week. Tonight with everything it has, and I have never in my life seen a vision so certain of itself. Then we'd best be ready tonight. We are as ready as 31,000 years of ice and hate can be prepared for," Melisandre said, and there was, for the first time since Jon had met her, No theater in her voice at all, just plain, unadorned dread. I want you to know before this begins that whatever comes of tonight, I no longer believe you are a mistake in my God's design. I believe, perhaps, that my God's design was always larger than the story I was told to serve, that there is room in it for a light that answers to no prophecy at all, only to itself, and to the people it chooses to protect. I do not know if that is heresy. I no longer particularly care. Jon didn't have an answer for that, not one that felt adequate to the moment, so he simply nodded and kept walking, and Melisandre let him. They came at moonrise, and there was no ice ladder this time, no careful test of the wall's defenses. The Night King simply walked his entire army out of the tree line in a single overwhelming wave that stretched from horizon to horizon. Tens of thousands of the dead moving in a silence more terrible than any battle roar could have been. And behind them, riding something Jon had no name for, vast and pale and wreathed in blue fire that gave no heat. The Night King himself came to finish what Hardhome had started. 7 hells, Davos breathed, standing beside Jon on the parapet, staring down at the sea of dead flowing toward them across the snow. I've sailed every corner of this world, Lord Snow, and I've never in my life seen anything like that. Nobody has, Jon said. That's the whole problem. Stannis, further along the wall with his officers, was already shouting orders, oil pots being hauled up, archers taking position. But Jon could see in the set of the king's shoulders, in the grim, tight line of his mouth, that even a man as certain of his own capacity as Stannis Baratheon understood, looking at that army, exactly how thin the margin between survival and annihilation had suddenly become. Get the wildlings positioned along the eastern stretch, Jon called down. Tormund, you know that ground better than anyone here. Hold it, whatever it costs. Sir Alizer, he found Thorne further along the wall, already armored, already grim, and something passed between them in that single glance that needed no further words to settle it. Hold the gate. If it breaks through, you're the last wall behind the wall. Aye, Lord Snow, Thorne said, and there was nothing in it now but plain, soldierly resolve. The old bitterness burned away by 4 months of watching this bastard boy prove, over and over, exactly the kind of man he actually was. The dead reached the base of the wall and began to climb, and this time there was no clever ice ladder to shatter. They simply climbed the ancient stone and ice itself with hands that felt no pain and bones that didn't tire. And the defenders met them at the top in a fight that had no clean lines left in it within the first 10 minutes. Oil and fire and screaming, and the terrible windless shriek of the dying dead blending into a single continuous roar that seemed to shake the wall itself. Jon fought along that parapet for what felt like hours. The rings borrowed clarity, the only thing keeping exhaustion and injury from catching up with him, cutting down wave after wave. And even with everything he could do, even with Tormund's fighters holding the east and Stannis' disciplined lines holding the center and Thorne grim and immovable at the gate, the sheer number of the dead began, slowly, inexorably, to tell. A section near the western stair gave way first, a dozen Wights breaking through a gap in the defense, and Jon was already moving toward it, Ghost tearing ahead of him when he felt it again. That vast attention, closer now than it had ever been, and he looked up to see the Night King himself standing at the base of the wall, looking up, and understood with a certainty that needed no words at all, that it had come, finally, to finish what Hardhome had started. The Night King raised one hand, and the ice along the wall's face where he stood began to grow, not a ladder this time, but something worse, a great climbing lattice of frost spreading in every direction at once, faster than fire, faster than anything Jon had ever seen it do before. And Jon understood with the same cold clarity that had let him unravel 100 Wights, that this was no longer a test. This was the Night King spending everything he had all at once, because he had finally understood what Hardhome had taught him too. That patience, against something that refused to burn out, was no longer a strategy that could be trusted to win. Jon went down the stairs 2 at a time and out through the small postern gate at the wall's base before anyone could stop him, Ghost at his heels, and stood alone in the open ground before the wall, facing the Night King across 30 feet of trampled, blood-black snow, while above him the battle raged on, unaware for the moment that its outcome had just narrowed down to this single point. "You want to finish it," Jon said. "Then finish it with me. Not the wall. Not the men up there who never asked for any of this. Me. You cannot win this." The thought pressed into him again, and this time there was something almost like genuine curiosity threaded through the ancient certainty of it. "I have unmade 1,000 kings who thought themselves your equal. I unmade the one who wore your name before you and every king before him back to the first dawn. Why do you not fear that the way every one of them eventually did? Because I didn't ask for this to make myself a king," Jon said, and felt saying it, the plain, simple truth of it settle into his bones like something finally, fully understood. "I asked for it, number I didn't even ask. It just found me. At the one moment I wasn't thinking about myself at all, only about the men beside me. Maybe that's the whole difference between me and every one of them. They wanted it to make themselves bigger. I only ever wanted it to keep the people behind me alive." The Night King came at him, and this time Jon didn't wait to be struck first. He moved with everything the ring had ever given him, every ounce of borrowed clarity and speed and terrible correct precision, and where he struck the Night King's ice-pale flesh, it did not simply resist him the way it had at Hardhome. It began, slowly, agonizingly, to crack, hairline fractures of blue light spreading from every wound like frost breaking under pressure it had never before been made to bear. The Night King struck back with everything it had too, and Jon felt bones crack that had only just finished healing, felt cold pour into him deep enough to make his own borrowed fire flicker and strain. And for a long, terrible stretch of that fight neither of them gave a single inch. Two forces older than either of them fully understood grinding against each other in the dark while a war raged on above them. Indifferent, unaware. It was Ghost who tipped it in the end, the direwolf tearing in low and fast at the exact moment. The Night King's attention narrowed fully onto Jon, sinking his jaws into a leg of ice-pale flesh, and wrenching hard enough to buy one single, crucial heartbeat of imbalance. And Jon took that heartbeat and drove Longclaw's dragon-glass-edged point through the center of the Night King's chest, with every last scrap of strength he had left in his broken, battered body. The shriek that followed was not windless. It had breath in it, and pain in it, and something that had not felt genuine pain in 10,000 years discovering, all at once, exactly how much of it there was left to feel. The Night King came apart. Not slowly, the way the Wights did all at once, shattering outward in a great silent explosion of ice and blue light that swept across the battlefield in every direction. And everywhere that light touched, the dead it had ever raised simply stopped, collapsed, fell still. An entire army losing in a single instant the will that had ever animated it at all. Jon felt the shockwave of it pass through him too, through the ring, through whatever strange connection had bound him to that ancient will since the moment he'd first put the ring on beyond the wall. And for one long, disorienting heartbeat, he felt something that might have been relief, or might have been an echo of something far older than relief, something that had waited 10,000 patient years for an ending, and had finally, unexpectedly, found one. Then it was gone, and Jon Snow was on his knees in the trampled, blood-black snow at the base of the wall, alone except for a direwolf pressing hard and warm against his side, and above him, along the whole length of the parapet, a battle that had been on the very edge of being lost simply, suddenly, stopped, because there was nothing left for anyone to fight. They found him there a few minutes later, Tormund first, roaring something that was half triumph and half raw disbelieving relief, then Stannis, and Davos and Melisandre, and finally Sam, pushing through all of them with a healer's satchel already in hand. And Jon let them lift him, let them carry him, too exhausted and too battered to do anything but let the world happen to him for the first time in longer than he could remember. "It's finished," he heard himself say, to no one in particular, as they carried him back through the gate into a courtyard full of exhausted, disbelieving, weeping survivors. "It's finished," Tormund said, walking close beside the makeshift litter, his voice rougher than usual. "Lad, it's finished. You did that, you hear me? You did that." Jon closed his eyes, the last of the ring's borrowed clarity finally, gratefully ebbing away, and let the noise of the courtyard wash over him, cheering, weeping, the particular ragged joy of people who had genuinely believed, right up until the last moment, that they would not survive the night and had, he did not yet know, drifting toward a long overdue and thoroughly earned unconsciousness, that the hardest fight of all, the one for what came after, for what a man does with a power that has just publicly, unmistakably, saved an entire realm, was only just beginning. Chapter 6. The wrong king. He woke to sunlight, which felt wrong before he'd even opened his eyes, because sunlight this far north in the dead of winter had become such a rare, thin thing that his body had half forgotten what to do with it. He lay still a moment, cataloging the damage the way he'd learned to do after every fight since the mutineers stabbed him, ribs aching but whole, a deep bone bruise along his left side, his hands stiff and scarred and blessedly attached to his arms, and found, beneath all of it, something he hadn't expected to find at all. Quiet. Not the held-breath quiet of the tomb or the grim, watchful quiet of a castle bracing for slaughter. Ordinary quiet. Birds outside the window, which hadn't been heard at Castle Black in longer than he could remember. Somewhere below, men laughing, actually laughing, the loose, unguarded sound of people who'd stopped expecting to die that day. "You're awake," Sam said from a chair pulled close to the bed, a book open and forgotten in his lap. "Clyda said you might sleep another full day. I told him he didn't know you very well." "How long?" 2 days. "You've missed a great deal and none of it's small." Sam set the book aside and leaned forward, and there was something in his face, exhaustion, yes, but underneath it unmistakably wonder. "Jon, it's over, all of it. Every wight that fell at the wall just stopped. Stopped. The scout Stannis sent out yesterday rode 2 days north and found nothing. No dead walking, no cold magic, nothing but empty forest and normal snow falling in a normal way. Whatever that thing was holding together, it's gone. You broke it. We broke it. Ghost mostly, if we're being honest about it. Ghost bit its leg. You put a sword through its heart." Sam managed something close to a laugh, thin and disbelieving. "I've been trying to write down everything that happened while it's still fresh, because I don't think anyone's going to believe this in 100 years otherwise, and half the men who saw it already can't agree on the details. Tormund's telling 3 different versions depending on how much he's had to drink." Jon pushed himself upright, slower than he wanted to admit, and looked down at his right hand. The ring sat there still, plain gold, warm as it had always been, utterly unremarkable to any eye that didn't know what it had just done. "Does it still?" he started. "I don't know," Sam said honestly. "I haven't dared get close enough to find out, and I don't think you should either, not yet. If whatever it was connected to is truly gone, maybe it's just a ring now. Or maybe it's not, and we won't know until, I don't know, Jon, until something else needs it." Cheerful thought. "I try." Sam hesitated, then added more carefully, "There's something else. Something I found translating the rest of that inscription, the night before the battle when I couldn't sleep and needed something to do with my hands that wasn't just worrying. I finally got the last line. And..." Sam pulled a scrap of parchment from inside the book, unfolded it, and read, slow and careful, the way he read everything that mattered to him. "It does not choose the strong, nor the worthy, nor the good. It chooses only the hand that holds it without asking what it might become for having held it. He looked up. I think that's the whole answer, Jon. I don't think it was ever about you being righteous, or pure, or better than Roderick Snow, or any of the men who wore it before either of you and let it eat them alive. I think it's just indifferent. It amplifies whatever's already there. Every king before you wanted more the moment he touched it, so it gave them more until more killed them. You didn't want anything for yourself in that moment. You wanted your men to live, so that's what it gave you the power to do. Jon sat with that a long while, turning the ring slowly on his finger, and thought that it was, in its way, the least comforting explanation Sam could have given him, and also, somehow, the truest one. It wasn't good. It wasn't cursed. It was a mirror that happened to have teeth. Then I suppose, Jon said finally, I'd better be careful for the rest of my life about what I let myself want. Stannis came to see him that afternoon alone, without Davos or Melisandre trailing behind him for once, and stood at the foot of the bed with an expression Jon had genuinely never seen on the man before, not the flat, calculating grimness of their earlier meetings, but something quieter, more uncertain, the look of a man recalculating a lifetime's worth of assumptions in real time and not entirely liking where the new sums were landing. Ravens have gone out, Stannis said, without greeting, to every great house still standing in the north, to the Vale, to my own remaining bannermen in the south. I did not write them myself, Lord Snow. I let Davos write the first one because I found, sitting down to it, that I did not entirely know how to describe what I watched happen at that wall without it sounding either mad or like the beginning of some new religion. And I have had quite enough of religion this past year to want to start another one by accident. What did he write? The truth, as near as either of us could manage it, that the army of the dead that has haunted every child's nightmare since the age of heroes marched on the wall in full force and was broken there, and will not march again because the thing that commanded it is destroyed. And that the man who destroyed it, Stannis said, and something almost pained crossed his face at having to say the next part plainly, was Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. You didn't have to put my name to it. I did actually, Stannis said, because within a week, every lord in the north will know it regardless, from 100 different mouths, half of them exaggerated past recognition. And I would rather the truth reach them first in plain than let it arrive already twisted into something neither of us can control. He paused, studying Jon with those deep-set, tired eyes. I have spent my whole life believing that legitimacy is the only thing that truly binds men to a cause, a crown, a birthright, a claim written into law and blood. I watched an army made of frightened wildlings, disgraced criminals and cold, hungry soldiers hold a wall against the literal end of the world 2 nights past, and I will tell you plainly, Lord Snow, that not one of them was thinking of my claim or the law or anything written on any parchment anywhere while they did it. They were thinking of you. They were thinking of staying alive, Your Grace. I'd not mistake that for anything grander. Perhaps. Stannis's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. But men do not fight that hard that long, for a stranger's survival alone. I offered you Winterfell once, and a name, and you refused it because you said you did not want it as a price for doing what was right regardless. I understand that now in a way I did not before the wall. I am not certain I like understanding it, because it means the thing that binds men most tightly is not the thing I have spent my whole life building my claim upon. He was quiet a moment, and then, in a voice that cost him something to produce, added, I owe you an apology, Lord Snow, for trying to buy what you were never going to sell. Jon studied him, and found to his own mild surprise that he believed the apology was genuine, not soft, not warm, never that, from a man built the way Stannis Baratheon was built, but genuine all the same. I'll take that, Your Grace, Jon said. And I'll tell you plainly what I told you before. I'll fight beside you against whatever comes next gladly, because a realm at war with itself, while something like what we just faced could exist at all, is a realm that's forgotten what actually matters. But I still won't take Winterfell from your hand. If it's ever mine again, it'll be because my own people call me to it, not because a king found it convenient to buy my loyalty with my father's seat. I begin to suspect, Stannis said, that your own people are about to do exactly that, whether either of us finds it convenient or not. He was right, though it took another fortnight for the full weight of it to land. The ravens carrying word of Hardhome and the battle at the wall reached White Harbor first, and from there spread through the north like fire through dry grass. 100 different versions of the same essential story, all of them true in their bones even where the details blurred. A bastard boy, Ned Stark's own blood no matter what name the law gave him, had broken the long night itself at the head of the Night's Watch, had saved wildling and Northman alike without asking either what banner they flew, had refused a crown offered freely by a king who badly needed him to take it. Lord Wyman Manderley's raven came first, careful and shrewdly worded, offering the watch grain and gold, and asking, delicately, whether the Lord Commander might find time to visit White Harbor when his duties allowed. Then came word from the mountain clans, blunter and less careful, from Lady Mormont of Bear Island, a girl of perhaps 10 years old, by the accounts Jon had heard, who wrote in a hand that hadn't fully steadied yet, but with a directness that made Jon laugh out loud for the first time in longer than he could remember. House Mormont remembers no king but the king in the north, whose name is Stark. We are with you, Lord Snow, whatever you decide to call yourself. House after house followed, Glover, Serwyn, even a careful, unsigned letter from within the Dreadfort itself, hinting at unrest among the Bolton garrison that had never fully trusted their lord's new alliance with House Frey. Bowen Marsh, tallying the letters at Jon's request with his usual meticulous care, looked up from the growing stack one evening with an expression of genuine bewilderment. They're not asking you to bend the knee to Stannis, Lord Snow, Marsh said. Half of them aren't even mentioning him. They're asking you to be king. Jon had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this was coming, had felt it building in every letter's careful phrasing, every lord's studied avoidance of Stannis' name, but hearing it said plainly still landed with an odd, hollow weight, like a door opening onto a room he'd spent his whole life certain would always stay closed to him. I'm sworn to the watch, he said. Whatever the North wants, that oath doesn't unmake itself because a raven says nice things about me. No, Marsh agreed carefully, but Lord Snow, with respect, and I say this as a man who spent 30 years believing the watch's oath was the one truly unbreakable thing left in this world, I think even the oath itself is going to have to answer to what just happened at that wall. The watch was built to guard against the long night. The long night is broken. I don't know what the watch becomes now, or what a commander's oath even means, in a world where the enemy it was sworn against no longer exists. It was, Jon thought, exactly the right question, and exactly the one he had no ready answer for. Alizer Thorne found him on the wall that evening, the two of them alone at the parapet's edge with the last light dying gold and orange over a horizon that no longer held anything worse in it than ordinary winter. Neither of them spoke for a long while, watching the light fade, and it was Thorne, finally, who broke the silence. I've served this watch 31 years, Thorne said. Fought at Ashford for House Baratheon before that. I've buried more brothers than I can name, and I've hated more bastards and wildling lovers than I care to remember, and I stood in your doorway a fortnight past ready to take something from you by force because I believed, truly believed, that no man could hold power like yours and stay a man worth trusting. He was quiet a moment. I watched you go down under that thing at Hardhome from the ship before I even knew what you were fighting. Watched you get back up. Watched you do it again at the wall 4 nights past, broken half to pieces, and still put yourself between that horror and everyone still standing behind you. Sir Alizer, let me finish, Snow. I've never once found it easy to say a thing like this, and I'll lose the nerve for it if you interrupt me. Thorne's jaw worked, the old hardness in his face cracking open into something rower, more honest than Jon had ever seen from him. I was wrong. Not about the danger of what you carry. I don't think I was wrong about that. Not entirely, because it is dangerous, and any fool who tells you otherwise is lying to make you feel comfortable. But I was wrong about you. I judged you the moment you walked through this gate a bastard boy with a direwolf and a bad name, and I never once let that judgment move, not through everything you did to earn otherwise, until I watched you die twice over in the space of a fortnight for people who'd never once done a single thing to earn your dying for them. He turned to face Jon fully. I don't know what you should do with what the North's asking of you. I've never been a wise enough man to answer questions that size. But I know this much, and I'll say it plain because it's the only apology I know how to give. Whatever you decide to be, Lord Snow, this watch is better for the 4 months you've commanded it than it was in the 30 years before you came to it. I'd have said that was impossible once. I don't think it's impossible anymore. Jon didn't say anything for a long moment, the wind pulling at both their cloaks, and then he held out his hand. Not the one with the ring, the other one, plain and scarred and entirely ordinary, and Thorne looked at it a moment before he took it, and they stood there at the edge of the world, an old knight and a young bastard shaking hands over something that had taken 4 months of blood and fear and grudging respect to finally arrive at. Melisandre came to him 3 nights later, and this time there was no theater in the visit at all, no fire, no dramatic entrance, just a woman in a plain gray traveling cloak, hair bound back, looking younger and more uncertain than Jon had ever seen her. I am leaving with the king when he marches south, she said. He means to press the Boltons at Winterfell before winter closes the roads entirely, and he'll want me at his side because, whatever doubts I carry now, I am still the only weapon of that particular kind he has left to bring against Roose Bolton's walls. You could stay. I could, Melisandre agreed, but I do not think I am meant to, Lord Snow, and I have finally, after everything, learned to trust that particular feeling again, even without the certainty I used to demand from it. She studied him a long moment. I want to tell you something before I go. And I want you to understand I do not say it lightly, because I have spent 20 years building my entire faith around a single unshakable belief, and watching that belief bend without breaking has been the hardest thing I have done since I was a slave girl in Asshai learning to read fire for masters who would have killed me for reading it wrong. I'm listening. I do not think you are Azor Ahai, she said. I think that story was always too small for whatever you actually are. Our lore's prophecy speaks of a hero who brings the dawn by burning back the dark with fire and sacrifice and blood. A story about a man who must lose something precious to win. You lost nothing that night at the wall that you were not already willing to lose the moment you swore your oath to that watch, years before any of this began. I think, Lord Snow, that the truest thing I have learned from watching you is that the world does not always send its saviors dressed in the shape of the prophecy that was written for them. Sometimes it simply sends a good man, standing exactly where he is needed, refusing to become anything less than himself even when the whole weight of ancient magic presses down on him demanding that he should. That's a strange thing for a priestess of the Lord of Light to say. Perhaps I am becoming a stranger sort of priestess, Melisandre said, something almost like a smile touching the corner of her mouth. Or perhaps I have simply, finally, learned the difference between faith and certainty, and discovered that only one of them was ever actually worth keeping. She inclined her head to him, formal and yet, somehow, entirely genuine. Farewell, Lord Snow. I do not know what you will choose to be when this is finished. I find, to my own surprise, that I am no longer afraid of whatever you decide." Mance Rayder held his own council, 3 days after that, in the great hall of Castle Black, and it was not a council of lords or knights, but of 100 wildling chiefs and elders crowded into a room built for southern knights who'd never once imagined it hosting a gathering like this, free folk from every clan that had survived Hardhome and the long march south, arguing, laughing, weeping, and finally, near midnight, arriving at a single decision that Mance carried to Jon himself the following morning. "They want to settle the gift," Mance said. "The land south of the wall the Watch has always claimed and never truly used. Not as slaves, not as prisoners behind some southern lord's wall, as free folk, with their own chiefs, answering to no crown but sworn to help hold this wall against whatever's left beyond it. Because even with the dead king broken, there's still cold out there, and worse things than cold, if the old stories are worth anything at all." "That's yours to grant near enough, Lord Commander," Bowen Marsh said, standing nearby, and there was no bitterness in it at all now, only tired practicality. "The gifts always technically belong to the Watch. No one's ever had the men to make use of it before." "Then it's granted," Jon said, "on my word, and I'll have Sam draw up whatever's needed to make it lawful in the eyes of any king who cares to argue otherwise." Mance studied him a moment, something wry and warm in his weathered face. "You know, Snow, 4 months back I'd have sworn on my own life that no crow would ever say those words to a wildling and mean them. 4 months back I'd have sworn the same thing," Jon admitted. "People change. Or maybe they just finally get shown enough of what's actually true to stop pretending otherwise." Mance said, "Maybe that's exactly it." He clasped Jon's hand, the same rough, genuine grip Thorn had offered a few nights before, 2 very different men arriving at the same simple respect from 2 entirely different directions. "For what it's worth, and I've fought against crows my whole life, so this costs me more than you'll ever know to say. If the North does call you king, Snow, you'll have every spear in the gift standing behind you the day you need them. That's not a debt. That's just what a man owes another man who pulled his people off a beach the whole world had already given up on." The letter that finally forced the question came a week later, not from a minor house testing the wind but from Lord Wyman Manderley himself, blunt where his earlier letter had been careful, backed by the seal of 6 other northern houses who'd apparently spent the last month quietly agreeing among themselves on exactly what they intended to demand. "The North remembers," it read, in Manderley's own broad, deliberate hand. "We remember Ned Stark, who never once asked to rule us and ruled us better for it. We remember his son Robb, who we called king in the North and lost too soon to treachery no true Northman will ever forgive. And we have watched, this past month, a 3rd Stark, bastard-born or not, the law has never mattered less to us than it does now, break the oldest enemy this world has ever known, at the cost of his own blood, for people who had no claim on his loyalty beyond simple decency. We do not ask you to take a crown for glory, Lord Snow. We ask you to take it because the North has no one else left standing who has earned it, and because a land that has just survived the end of the world deserves, at the very least, a king who wanted nothing from the surviving of it but the survival itself." Jon read it twice, alone in his chambers, the ring warm and quiet on his finger where it had stayed, undisturbed since the battle. He thought of his father, sitting in his solar at Winterfell with letters like this one, weighing duty against desire the way Ned Stark had weighed everything his whole life. He thought of Robb, riding south with a crown he'd never wanted either, until wanting it had cost him everything. He thought of Roderick Snow, 8,000 years dead, murdered for shining too bright in a world that had decided, in its fear, that his light was more dangerous than the dark it burned against. He thought, too, of the ring's own inscription, the one Sam had finally fully translated. It does not choose the strong, nor the worthy, nor the good. It chooses only the hand that holds it without asking what it might become for having held it. That, he realized, sitting alone with Manderley's letter in his hands, was the whole answer, and it had been the answer since the moment he'd first closed his fingers around a plain gold band in a dead king's tomb, dying, thinking of nothing but the men beside him. He had never asked what the ring might make him. He had only ever asked what needed doing. Perhaps that was the whole difference between accepting a crown and being consumed by one, not refusing power, not hiding from it, but simply never letting the question of what it made of him outweigh the question of what needed protecting. He gathered them all 3 days later, Stannis and Davos, Sam and Tormund, Bowen Marsh and Alizer Thorne, Mance Rayder standing at the back of the hall with a dozen wildling chiefs behind him, and told them plainly what he'd decided. "I won't take Winterfell as a gift from any king," Jon said, "the same as I told his grace when he first offered it, and that hasn't changed. But Lord Manderley's letter isn't a gift. It's a demand from my own people, freely made, and I don't think refusing that out of some misplaced pride would be any less a betrayal of everything I've fought for than accepting a crown for the wrong reasons would be." He looked at Stannis directly. "I'll ride to Winterfell, your grace, and I'll take back what the Boltons stole through murder and treachery, and I'll do it fighting beside you, not against you, because the North needs both our swords more than it needs either of us proving a point about whose claim outweighs whose. But when it's done, I'll hold the North as the North's own king, sworn to no throne but the one my own people asked me to sit, and I'll expect you to accept that the way I've accepted every hard truth you've handed me since the day you rode through this gate." Stannis was silent a long moment, and Jon watched the old, familiar calculation move behind his eyes, cost against benefit, pride against necessity, the whole cold arithmetic of a man who had spent his life building a claim to a throne now being asked to concede, in practice if not in law, that another man's claim to a smaller one mattered more to the people living under it than his own ever would. "You're asking me to accept an independent North," Stannis said finally, "in exchange for nothing but your sword against the Boltons, and whatever debt of gratitude a grateful people might extend to me for helping put you there. I'm asking you to accept that a realm which just survived the end of the world doesn't need one more war fought over who kneels to whom," Jon said. "You came north to fight the true enemy, your grace. You said it yourself, the first day you rode through this gate, your war and mine were the same war. That war's won. What's left is deciding what kind of peace we build out of the ashes of it, and I don't think that peace survives if every surviving crown spends the next 10 years trying to conquer every other one." Davos, standing quietly at his king's shoulder, said nothing, but Jon caught, in the old smuggler's face, something that looked very much like hope. Stannis was quiet a long, long while, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual hard finality in it, something more tired, more honest. A man who had spent a lifetime measuring his worth in thrones finally admitting, if only to himself, that he had just watched a different kind of worth entirely prove itself in front of him. "I have spent my whole life believing that the only thing worth ruling for is the throne itself," Stannis said. "I begin to think, Lord Snow, that I was wrong about that too, the same as I was wrong about you. Very well. Help me break the Boltons, and I will recognize the North as its own kingdom, sworn to its own king, and I will call that a fair price for everything you have already given this realm without once asking anything in return." He extended a hand, the gesture as stiff and formal as everything else about the man, and Jon took it, and it was done, not with fanfare, not with singers or feasts, but with the same plain, unglamorous honesty that had marked nearly everything between them since the day Stannis rode through the gate. They marched south a week later, the Watch's forces and Stannis' army and 2,000 of Mance's free folk fighters together. Banners of the stag and the direwolf snapping side by side in a wind that, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, didn't carry the particular deep, killing cold of something ancient watching from beyond the trees. Jon rode at the head of it, Ghost loping easy at his horse's side, the ring warm on his hand where he no longer felt any need to hide it, because there was nothing left to hide it from. No mutinous fear waiting in the dark, no red priestess searching flames for a prophecy he'd never fit, no ancient patient will measuring him from beyond a wall of ice. There was only the long road south, and Winterfell waiting at the end of it, and whatever came after that would come as it always had, one hard, honest choice at a time, made by a man who had learned, in a buried tomb beneath the haunted forest, that the truest test of power was never whether you could seize it. It was whether you could hold it, and still remain, at the end of everything, exactly the man you'd always meant to be. The ring had been made once by something ancient and hungry to find the darkest ambition hiding in any heart strong enough to wear it, and bend the whole world to that ambition's shape. It had found, instead, a bastard boy who only ever wanted to keep the people behind him alive, and in choosing him, however wrongly, by whatever old and terrible design had first shaped it, it had made, for the first time in all its long and murderous history, exactly the right mistake. Somewhere beyond the wall, the wind swept clean and cold and ordinary across an empty forest, disturbing nothing, hiding nothing, holding, for the first time in 10,000 years, no ancient watching thing at all. And somewhere on the road south, riding beneath a banner that had not flown free over the north in longer than any living memory, Jon Snow rode on toward a crown he had never wanted, wearing a ring the world had never understood, exactly the wrong king it had always needed.